Chapter 11 for knowledge of the existence of other things. The knowledge of our own being we have by intuition. The existence of a God reason clearly makes known to us, as has been shown. The knowledge of the existence of any other thing we can have only by sensation, for there being no necessary connection of real existence with any idea a man hath in his memory, nor of any other existence but that of God with the existence of any particular man. No particular man can know the existence of any other being, but only when, by actual operating upon him, it makes itself perceived by him. For the having the idea of anything in our mind no more proves the existence of that thing than the picture of a man evidences his being in the world, or the visions of a dream make thereby a true history. It is therefore the actual receiving of ideas from without that gives us notice of the existence of other things and makes us know that something doth exist at that time without us, which causes that idea in us, though perhaps we neither know nor consider how it does it, for it takes not from the certainty of our senses and the ideas we receive by them, that we know not the manner wherein they are produced, v.g. whilst I write this I have, by the paper affecting my eyes, that idea produced in my mind, which whatever object causes I call white, by which I know that quality or accident, i.e., whose appearance before my eyes always causes that idea, doth really exist and hath a being without me. And of this the greatest assurance I can possibly have, and to which my faculties can attain, is the testimony of my eyes, which are the proper and sole judges of this thing, whose testimony I have reason to rely on as so certain that I can no more doubt, whilst I write this, that I see white and black, and that something really exists that causes that sensation in me, than that I write or move my hand, which is a certainty as great as human nature is capable of concerning the existence of anything but a man's self alone and of God. The notice we have by our senses of the existing of things without us, though it be not altogether so certain as our intuitive knowledge or the deductions of our reason employed about the clear abstract ideas of our own minds, yet it is an assurance that deserves the name of knowledge, if we persuade ourselves that our faculties act and inform us right concerning the existence of those objects that affect them. It cannot pass for an ill-grounded confidence, for I think nobody can in earnest be so skeptical as to be uncertain of the existence of those things which he sees and feels. At least he that can doubt so far, whatever he may have with his own thoughts, will never have any controversy with me, since he can never be sure I say anything contrary to his own opinion. As to myself, I think God has given me assurance enough of the existence of things without me, since by their different application I can produce in myself both pleasure and pain, which is one great concernment of my present state. This is certain, the confidence that our faculties do not herein deceive us in the greatest assurance we are capable of concerning the existence of material beings. For we cannot act anything but by our faculties, nor talk of knowledge itself, but by the help of those faculties which are filtered to apprehend even what knowledge is. But besides the assurance we have from our senses themselves that they do not err in the information they give us of the existence of things without us when they are affected by them, we are further confirmed in this assurance by other concurrent reasons. First, it is plain those perceptions are produced in us by exterior causes affecting our senses, because those that want the organs of any sense never can have the idea belonging to that sense produced in their minds. This is too evident to be doubted, and therefore we cannot but be assured that they come in by the organs of that sense, and no the way the organs themselves, it is plain, do not produce them, for then the eyes of a man in the dark would produce colors, and his nose smell roses, in the winter, but we see nobody gets the relish of a pineapple till he goes to the Indies, where it is, and tastes it. Secondly, because sometimes I find that I cannot avoid the having those ideas produced in my mind, for though when my eyes are shut or windows fast, I can at pleasure recall to my mind the ideas of light or the sun, which former sensations had lodged in my memory, so I can at pleasure lay by that idea and take into my view that of the smell of a rose or taste of sugar. But if I turn my eyes at noon towards the sun, I cannot avoid the ideas which the light or sun then produces in me, so that there is a manifest difference between the ideas laid up in my memory, or which, if they were there only, I should have constantly the same power to dispose of them and lay them by at pleasure, and those which force themselves upon me, and I cannot avoid having, and therefore it must needs be some exterior cause and the brisk acting of some object without me, whose efficacy I cannot resist, that produces those ideas in my mind, whether I will or no. Besides, there is nobody who doth not perceive the difference in himself between contemplating the sun, as he hath the idea of it in his memory, and actually looking upon it, of which too his perception is so distinct that few of his ideas are more distinguishable one from another, and therefore he hath certain knowledge that they are not both memory or the actions of his mind, and fancy is only within him, but that actual seeing hath a cause without. Thirdly, add to this that many of those ideas are produced in us with pain, which afterwards we remember without the least offense. Thus the pain of heat or cold, when the idea of it is revived in our minds, gives us no disturbance, which when felt was very troublesome, and is again when actually repeated, which is occasioned by the disorder the external object causes in our bodies when applied to them, and we remember the pains of hunger, thirst, or the headache without any pain at all, which would either never disturb us or else constantly do it as often as we thought of it. Were there nothing more but ideas floating in our minds, the appearances entertaining our fancies, without a real existence of things affecting us from abroad? The same may be said of pleasure accompanying several actual sensations, and though mathematical demonstration depends not upon sense, yet the examining them by diagrams gives great credit to the evidence of our sight, and seems to give it a certainty approaching to that of demonstration itself. For it would be very strange that a man should allow it for an undeniable truth that two angles of a figure, which he measures by lines and angles of a diagram, should be bigger one than the other, and yet doubt of the existence of those lines and angles, which by looking on he makes use of to measure that by. Fourthly, our senses in many cases bear witness to the truth of each other's report concerning the existence of sensible things without us. He that sees a fire may, if he doubt whether it be anything more than a bare fancy, feel it too, and be convinced by putting his hand in it, which certainly could never be put into such exquisite pain by a bare idea of phantom, unless that the pain be a fancy too, which yet he cannot, when the burn is well, by raising the idea of it being upon himself again. Thus I see whilst I write this, I can change the appearance of the paper, and by designing the letters tell beforehand what new idea it shall exhibit the very next moment, by barely drawing my pen over it, which will never appear, let me fancy as much as I will, if my hands stand still, although I move my pen, if my eyes be shut, no. When those characters are once made on the paper, can I choose afterwards but see them as they are, that is, have the ideas of such letters as I have made, whence it is manifest that they are not barely the sport and play of my own imagination, when I find that the characters that were made at the pleasure of my own thoughts do not obey them, nor yet cease to be whenever I shall fancy it, but continue to affect my senses constantly and regularly according to the figures I made them. To which if we will add that the sight of those shall from another man draw such sounds as I beforehand designed they shall stand for, there will be little reason left to doubt that those words I write do really exist without me. Then, when they cause a long series of regular sounds to affect my ears, which could not be the effect of my imagination, nor could my memory retain them in that order. But yet, if after all this anyone will be so skeptical as to distrust his senses and to affirm that all we see and hear, feel and taste, think and do during our whole being is but the series and deluding appearances of a long dream, whereof there is no reality, and therefore will question the existence of all things or our knowledge of anything, I must desire him to consider that if all be a dream, then he doth but dream that he makes the question. And so it is not much matter that a waking man should answer him, but yet if he pleases, he may dream that I make him this answer, that the certainty of things existing in rerum natura, when we have the testimony of our senses, for it is not only as great as our frame can attain to, but as our condition needs, for our faculties being suited not to the full extent of being, nor to a perfect, clear, comprehensive knowledge of things, free from all doubt and scruple, but to the preservation of us in whom they are, and accumulated to the use of life. They serve to our purpose well enough if they will but give us certain notice of those things which are convenient or inconvenient to us. For he that sees a candle burning and hath experimented the force of its flame by putting his finger in it, will little doubt that this is something existing without him, which does him harm and puts him to great pain, which is assurance enough when no man requires greater certainty to govern his actions by that what is as certain as his actions themselves. And if our dreamer pleases to try whether the glowing heat of a glass furnace be barely a wandering imagination and a drowsy man's fancy, by putting his hand into it, he may perhaps be wakened into a certainty greater than he could wish, that it is something more than bare imagination, so that his evidence is as great as we can desire, being as certain to us as our pleasure or pain, i.e. happiness or misery, beyond which we have no concernment either of knowing or being. Such an assurance of the existence of things without us is sufficient to direct us in attaining the good and avoiding the evil which is caused by them, which is the important concernment we have of being made acquainted with them. In fine, then, when our senses do actually convey into our understandings any idea, we cannot but be satisfied that there doth something at that time really exist without us, which doth affect our senses, and by them give notice of itself to our apprehensive faculties, and actually produce that idea which we then perceive. And we cannot so far distrust their testimony as to doubt that such collections of simple ideas as we have observed by our senses to be united together do really exist together. But this knowledge extends as far as the present testimony of our senses employed about particular objects that do then affect them, and no further. For if I saw such a collection of simple ideas as is wont to be called man existing together 1 minute since, and am now alone, I cannot be certain that the same man exists now, since there is no necessary connection of his existence a minute since with his existence now. By 1,000 ways he may cease to be, since I had the testimony of my senses for his existence. And if I cannot be certain that the man I saw last today is now in being, I can less be certain that he so who have been longer removed from my senses, and I have not seen since yesterday or since the last year, and much less can I be certain of the existence of men that I never saw, and therefore, though it be highly probable that millions of men do now exist, yet whilst I am alone writing this, I have not that certainty of it which we strictly call knowledge. though the great likelihood of it puts me past doubt, and it be reasonable for me to do several things upon the confidence that there are men and men also of my acquaintance with whom I have to do now in the world. But this is but probability, not knowledge. Whereby yet we may observe how foolish and vain a thing it is for a man of a narrow knowledge, who, having reason given him to judge of the different evidence and probability of things, and to be swayed accordingly, how vain, I say, it is to expect demonstration and certainty in things not capable of it, and refuse assent to very rational propositions, and act contrary to very plain and clear truths, because they cannot be made out so evident as to surmount the least, I will not say reason, but pretense of doubting. He that in the ordinary affairs of life would admit of nothing but direct plain demonstration would be sure of nothing in this world but of perishing quickly. The wholesomeness of his meat or drink would not give him reason to venture on it, and I would fain know what it is he could do upon such grounds as are capable of no doubt, no objection. As when our senses are actually employed about any object, we do know that it does exist. So by our memory we may be assured that heretofore things that affected our senses have existed, and thus we have knowledge of the past existence of several things, whereof our senses having informed us, our memories still retain the ideas, and of this we are past all doubt, so long as we remember well. But this knowledge also reaches no further than our senses have formerly assured us. Thus, seeing water at this instant, it is an unquestionable truth to me that water doth exist. And remembering that I saw it yesterday, it will also be always true, and as long as my memory retains it, always an undoubted proposition to me that water did exist 10th of July 1688, as it will also be equally true that a certain number of very fine colours did exist, which at the same time I saw upon a bubble of that water. But being now quite out of sight both of the water and bubbles too, it is no more certainly known to me that the water doth now exist than that the bubbles or colours therein do so, it being no more necessary that water should exist today because it existed yesterday, than that the colours or bubbles exist today because they existed yesterday, though it be exceedingly much more probable, because water hath been observed to continue long in existence, but bubbles and the colours on them quickly cease to be. What ideas we have of spirits and how we come by them I have already shown, but how we have those ideas in our minds and know we have them there, the having the ideas of spirits does not make us know that any such things do exist without us, or that there are any finite spirits or any other spiritual beings but the eternal God. We have ground from revelation and several other reasons to believe with assurance that there are such creatures, but our senses not being able to discover them, we want the means of knowing their particular existences. For we can no more know that there are finite spirits really existing by the idea we have of such beings in our minds, than by the ideas anyone has of fairies or centaurs. He can come to know that things answering those ideas do really exist. And therefore, concerning the existence of finite spirits as well as several other things, we must content ourselves with the evidence of faith, but universal certain propositions concerning this matter are beyond our reach. For however true it may be, v.g. that all the intelligent spirits that God ever created do still exist, yet it can never make a part of our certain knowledge. These and the like propositions we may assent to as highly probable, but are not, I fear, in this state capable of knowing. We are not, then, to put others upon demonstrating know ourselves upon search of universal certainty in all those matters wherein we are not capable of any other knowledge, but what our senses give us in this or that particular. By which it appears that there are two sorts of propositions. One, there is one sort of propositions concerning the existence of anything answerable to such an idea as having the idea of an elephant, phoenix, motion, or an angel. In my mind, the first and natural inquiry is whether such a thing does anywhere exist, and this knowledge is only of particulars. No existence of anything without us, but only of God, can certainly be known further than our senses inform us. 2. There is another sort of propositions wherein is expressed the agreement or disagreement of our abstract ideas and their dependence on one another. Such propositions may be universal and certain. So, having the idea of God and myself, of fear and obedience, I cannot but be sure that God is to be feared and obeyed by me, and this proposition will be certain concerning man in general, if I have made an abstract idea of such a species whereof I am one particular. But yet this proposition, how certain soever that men ought to fear and obey God, proves not to me the existence of man in the world, but will be true of all such centaurs whenever they do exist, which certainty of such general propositions depends on the agreement or disagreement to be discovered in those abstract ideas. In the former case, our knowledge is the consequence of the existence of things producing ideas in our minds by our senses. In the latter, knowledge is the consequence of the ideas, be they what they will, that are in our minds producing their general certain propositions. Many of these are called aeternae veritatis, and all of them indeed are so, not from being written or all or any of them in the minds of all men, or that there were any of them propositions in anyone's mind, till he, having got the abstract ideas, joined or separated them by affirmation or negation. But whatsoever we can suppose such a creature as man is, endowed with such faculties, and thereby furnished with such ideas as we have, we must conclude he must needs, when he applies his thoughts to the consideration of his ideas, know the truth of certain propositions that will arise from the agreement or disagreement which we will perceive in his own ideas. Such propositions are therefore called eternal truths, not because they are eternal propositions actually formed and antecedent to the understanding that at any time makes them, nor because they are imprinted on the mind from any patterns that are anywhere out of the mind and existed before, but because, being once made about abstract ideas so as to be true, they will, whenever they can be supposed to be made again at any time, past or to come, by a mind having those ideas always actually be true. For names being supposed to stand perpetually for the same ideas, and the same ideas having immutably the same habitudes one to another, propositions concerning any abstract ideas that are once true must needs be eternal verities. Chapter 12. Of the improvement of our knowledge. It having been the common received opinion amongst men of letters that maxims were the foundation of all knowledge, and that the sciences were each of them built upon certain praecognita from whence the understanding was to take its rise, and by which it was to conduct itself in its inquiries into the matters belonging to that science, the beaten road of the schools has been to lay down in the beginning one or more general propositions as foundations whereon to build the knowledge that was to be had of that subject. These doctrines thus laid down for foundations of any science were called principles, as the beginnings from which we must set out, and look no further backwards in our inquiries, as we have already observed. One thing which might probably give an occasion to this way of proceeding is in the other sciences was, as I suppose, the good success it seemed to have in mathematics, wherein men being observed to attain a great certainty of knowledge, these sciences came by preeminence to be called mathemata, and mathesis, learning, or things learned, thoroughly learned, as having of all others the greatest certainty, clearness, and evidence in them. But if anyone will consider, he will, I guess, find that the great advancement and certainty of real knowledge which men arrived to in these sciences was not owing to the influence of these principles, nor derived from any peculiar advantage they received from 2 or 3 general maxims laid down in the beginning, but from the clear, distinct, and complete ideas their thoughts were employed about, and the relation of
equality and excess so clear between some of them that they had an intuitive knowledge, and by that way to discover it in others, and this without the help of those maxims. For I ask, is it not possible for a young lad to know that his whole body is bigger than his little finger, but by virtue of this axiom that the whole is bigger than a part, nor be assured of it till he has learned that maxim? Or cannot a country wench know that, having received a shilling from one that owes her 3, and a shilling also from another that owes her 3, the remaining debts in each of their hands are equal? Cannot she know this, I say, unless she fetch the certainty of it from this maxim, that if you take equals from equals, the remainder will be equals, a maxim which possibly she never heard or thought of? I desire any one to consider, from what has been elsewhere said, which is known first and clearest by most people, the particular instance or the general rule, and which it is that gives life and birth to the other. These general rules are but the comparing our more general and abstract ideas, which are the workmanship of the mind, made and names given to them for the easier dispatch of in its reasonings, and drawing into comprehensive terms and short rules its various and multiplied observations. But knowledge began in the mind and was founded on particulars, though afterwards perhaps no notice was taken thereof, it being natural for the mind forward still to enlarge its knowledge most attentively, to lay up those general notions and make the proper use of them, which is to disburden the memory of the cumbersome load of particulars. For I desire it may be considered what more certainty there is to a child or anyone that his body, little finger and all, is bigger than his little finger alone, after you have given to his body the name whole, and to his little finger the name part, than he could have had before. Or what new knowledge concerning his body can these two relative terms give him, which he could not have without them? Could he not know that his body was bigger than his little finger, if his language were yet so imperfect that he had no such relative terms as whole and part? I ask further, when he has got these names, how is he more certain that his body is a whole and his little finger a part, than he was or might be certain before he learned those terms, that his body was bigger than his little finger? Anyone may as reasonably doubt or deny that his little finger is a part of his body as that it is less than his body, and he that can doubt whether it be less will as certainly doubt whether it be a part, so that the maxim, the whole is bigger than a part, can never be made use of to prove the little finger less than the body, but when it is useless by being brought to convince one of a truth which he knows already. For he that does not certainly know that any parcel of matter with another parcel of matter joined to it is bigger than either of them alone, will never be able to know it by the help of these two relative terms, whole and part. Make of them what maxim you please. But be it in the mathematics as it will, whether it be clearer that taking an inch from a black line of 2 inches and an inch from a red line of 2 inches, the remaining parts of the two lines will be equal, or that if you take equals from equals, the remainder will be equals, which I say of these two is the clearer and first known. I leave to anyone to determine it, not being material to my present occasion. That which I have here to do is to inquire whether, if it be the readiest way to knowledge, to begin with general maxims and build upon them, it be yet a safe way to take the principles which are laid down in any other science as unquestionable truths, and so receive them without examination and adhere to them without suffering them to be doubted of, because mathematicians have been so happy or so fair to use none but self-evident and undeniable. If this be so, I know not what may not pass for truth in morality, what may not be introduced and proved in natural philosophy. Let that principle of some of the old philosophers, that all is matter and that there is nothing else, be received for certain, and indubitable, and it would be easy to be seen by the writings of some that have revived it again in our days, what consequences it will lead us into. Let anyone with Polemo take the world, or with the Stoics the ether or the sun, or with Anaximenes the air, to be God, and what a divinity, religion, and worship must we needs have. Nothing can be so dangerous as principles thus taken up without questioning or examination, especially if they be such as concern morality, which influence men's lives and give a bias to all their actions, who might not justly expect another kind of life in Aristippus, who placed happiness in bodily pleasure, and in Antisthenes, who made virtue sufficient to felicity, and he who with Plato shall place beatitude in the knowledge of God will have his thoughts raised to other contemplations than those who look not beyond this spot of earth and those perishing things which are to be had in it. He that with Archelaus shall lay it down as a principle that right and wrong, honest and dishonest, are defined only by laws and not by nature, will have other measures of moral rectitude and pravity than those who take it for granted that we are under obligations antecedent to all human constitutions. If therefore those that pass for principles are not certain, which we must have some way to know, that we may be able to distinguish them from those that are doubtful, but are only made so to us by our blind assent, we are liable to be misled by them, and instead of being guided into truth, we shall by principles be only confirmed in mistake and error. But since the knowledge of the certainty of principles as well as of all other truths depends only upon the perception we have of the agreement or disagreement of our ideas, the way to improve our knowledge is not, I am sure, blindly and with an implicit faith to receive and swallow principles, but is, I think, to get and fix in our minds clear, distinct, and complete ideas as far as they are to be had, and annex to them proper and constant names, and this perhaps without any other principles, but barely considering those perfect ideas, and by comparing them one with another, finding their agreement and disagreement, and their several relations and habitudes, we shall get more true and clear knowledge by the conduct of this one rule than by taking up principles and thereby putting our minds into the disposal of others. We must therefore, if we will proceed as reason advises, adapt our methods of inquiry to the nature of the ideas we examine and the truth we search after. General and certain truths are only founded in the habitudes and relations of abstract ideas. A sagacious and methodical application of our thoughts for the finding out these relations is the only way to discover all that can be put with truth and certainty concerning them into general propositions. But what steps we are to proceed in these is to be learned in the schools of the mathematicians, who from very plain and easy beginnings, by gentle degrees and a continued chain of reasonings, proceed to the discovery and demonstration of truths that appear at first sight beyond human capacity. The art of finding proofs and the admirable methods they have invented for the singling out and laying in order those intermediate ideas that demonstratively show the equality or inequality of unapplicable quantities is that which has carried them so far and produced such wonderful and unexpected discoveries. But whether something like this is in respect of other ideas as well as those of magnitude may not in time be found out, I will not determine. This I think I may say, that if other ideas that are the real as well as nominal lessons of their species were pursued in the way familiar to mathematicians, they would carry our thoughts further and with greater evidence and clearness than possibly we are apt to imagine. This gave me the confidence to advance that conjecture which I suggest chapter 3, viz. That morality is capable of demonstration as well as mathematics, for the ideas that ethics are conversant about being all real essences, and such as I imagine have a discoverable connection and agreement one with another, so far as we can find their habitudes and relations, so far we shall be possessed of certain real and general truths, and I doubt not but if a right method were taken, a great part of morality might be made out with that clearness that could leave to a considering man no more reason to doubt than he could have to doubt of the truth of propositions in mathematics which have been demonstrated to him. In our search after the knowledge of substances, our want of ideas that are suitable to such a way of proceeding obliges us to a quite different method. We advance not here, as in the other, where our abstract ideas are real as well as nominal essences, by contemplating our ideas and considering their relations and correspondences. That helps us very little for the reasons that in another place we have at large set down, by which I think it is evident that substances afford matter of very little general knowledge, and the bare contemplation of their abstract ideas will carry us but a very little way in the search of truth and certainty. What then are we to do for the improvement of our knowledge in substantial beings? Here we are to take a quite contrary course. The want of ideas of their real essences sends us from our own thoughts to the things themselves as they exist. Experience here must teach me what reason cannot, and it is by trying alone that I can certainly know what other qualities coexist with those of my complex idea, v.g. whether that yellow, heavy, fusible body I call gold be malleable or no, which experience, which way ever it prove in that particular body I examine, makes me not certain that it is so in all or any other yellow, heavy, fusible bodies, but that which I have tried, because it is no consequence one way or the other from my complex idea. The necessity or inconsistency or malleability have no visible connection with the combination of that color, weight, and fusibility in any body. What I have said here of the nominal essence of gold, supposed to consist of a body of such a determinate color, weight, and fusibility, will hold true if malleableness, fixedness, and solubility in aqua regia be added to it. Our reasonings from these ideas will carry us but a little way into certain discovery of the other properties in those masses of matter wherein all these are to be found, because the other properties of such bodies, depending not on these but on that unknown real essence on which these also depend, we cannot by them discover the rest. We can go no further than the simple ideas of our nominal essence will carry us, which is very little beyond themselves, and so afford us but very sparingly any certain universal and useful truths. For upon trial, having found that particular piece and all others of that color, weight, and fusibility that I ever tried, malleable, that also makes now perhaps a part of my complex idea, part of my nominal essence of gold, whereby though I make my complex idea, to which I affix the name gold, to consist of more simple ideas than before, yet still, it not containing the real essence of any species of bodies, it helps me not certainly to know, I say to know, or perhaps it may be to conjecture, the other remaining properties of that body further than they have a visible connection with some or all of the simple ideas that make up my nominal essence. For example, I cannot be certain from this complex idea whether gold be fixed or no, because as before there is no necessary connection or inconsistency to be discovered betwixt a complex idea of a body yellow, heavy, fusible, malleable, betwixt these, I say, and fixedness, so that I may certainly know that in whatsoever body these are found, their fixedness is sure to be. Here, again, for assurance, I must apply myself to experience as far as that reaches. I may have certain knowledge, but no further. I deny not but a man accustomed to rational and regular experiments shall be able to see further into the nature of bodies and guess righter at their yet unknown properties than one that is a stranger to them. But yet, as I have said, this is but judgment and opinion, not knowledge and certainty. This way of getting and improving our knowledge in substances only by experience and history, which is all that the weakness of our faculties in this state of mediocrity which we are in this world can attain to, makes me suspect that natural philosophy is not capable of being made a science. We are able, I imagine, to reach very little general knowledge concerning the species of bodies and their several properties.
experiments and historical observations we may have, from which we may draw advantages of ease and health, and thereby increase our stock of conveniences for this life. But beyond this, I fear our talents reach not, nor are our faculties, as I guess, able to advance. From whence it is obvious to conclude that, since our faculties are not fitted to penetrate into the internal fabric and real essences of bodies, but yet plainly discover to us the being of a God and the knowledge of ourselves enough to lead us into a full and clear discovery of our duty and great concernment, it will become us as rational creatures to employ those faculties we have about what they are most adapted to, and follow the direction of nature where it seems to point us out the way. For it is rational to conclude that our proper employment lies in those inquiries and in that sort of knowledge which is most suited to our natural capacities and carries in it our greatest interest, i.e., the condition of our eternal state. Hence, I think I may conclude that morality is the proper science and business of mankind in general, who are both concerned and fitted to search out their summum bonum, as several arts conversant about several parts of nature are the lot and private talent of particular men for the common use of human life and their own particular subsistence in this world. Of what consequence the discovery of one natural body and its properties may be to human life, the whole great continent of America is a convincing instance, whose ignorance is in useful arts and want of the greatest part of the conveniences of life in a country that abounded with all sorts of natural plenty, I think may be attributed to their ignorance of what was to be found in a very ordinary despicable stone, I mean the mineral of iron. And whatever we think of our parts or improvements in this part of the world, where knowledge and plenty seem to vie with each other, yet to anyone that will seriously reflect on it, I suppose it will appear past doubt that where the use of iron lost among us, we should in a few ages be unavoidably reduced to the wants and ignorance of the ancient savage Americans, whose natural endowments and provisions come no way short of those of the most flourishing and polite nations, so that he who first made known the use of that contemptible mineral may be truly styled the father of arts and author of plenty. I would not, therefore, be thought to disesteem or dissuade the study of nature. I readily agree the contemplation of his works gives us occasion to admire, revere, and glorify their author, and if rightly directed may be of greater benefit to mankind than the monuments of exemplary charity that have at so great charge been raised by the founders of hospitals and almshouses. He that first invented printing discovered the use of the compass, or made public the virtue and right use of quinquina, did more for the propagation of knowledge, for the supply and increase of useful commodities, and saved more from the grave than those who built colleges, workhouses, and hospitals. All that I would say is that we should not be too forwardly possessed with the opinion or expectation of knowledge where it is not to be had, or by ways that will not attain to it. That we should not take doubtful systems for complete sciences, nor unintelligible notions for scientific demonstrations. In the knowledge of bodies, we must be content to glean what we can from particular experiments, since we cannot, from a discovery of their real essences, grasp at a time whole sheaves, and in bundles comprehend the nature and properties of whole species together. Where our inquiry is concerning coexistence or repugnancy to coexist, which by contemplation of our ideas we cannot discover, their experience, observation, and nature history must give us by our senses and by retail an insight into corporeal substances. The knowledge of bodies we must get by our senses, verily employed in taking notice of their qualities and operations on one another. And what we hope to know of separate spirits in this world, we must, I think, expect only from revelation. He that shall consider how little general maxims, precarious principles, and hypotheses laid down at pleasure have promoted true knowledge, or helped to satisfy the inquiries of rational men after real improvements. How little, I say, the setting out and setting out at that end has, for many ages together, advanced men's progress towards the knowledge of natural philosophy, will think we have reason to thank those who, in this latter age, have taken another course and have trod out to us, though not an easy way to learned ignorance, yet a surer way to profitable knowledge. Not that we may not, to explain any phenomena of nature, make use of any probable hypothesis whatsoever. Hypotheses, if they are well made, are at least great helps to the memory, and often direct us to new discoveries. But my meaning is that we should not take up any one too hastily, which the mind that would always penetrate into the course of things, and have principles to rest on, is very apt to do, till we have very well examined particulars and made several experiments in that thing which we would explain by our hypothesis, and see whether it will agree to them all, whether our principles will carry us quite through, and not be as inconsistent with one phenomenon of nature as they seem to accommodate and explain another, and at least that we take care that the name of principles deceive us not, nor impose on us by making us receive that for an unquestionable truth which is really at best but a very doubtful conjecture, such as I had almost said all of the hypothesis in natural philosophy. But whether natural philosophy be capable of certainty or no, the ways to enlarge our knowledge as far as we are capable seem to me, in short, to be these two. The first is to get and settle in our minds determined ideas of those things whereof we have general or specific names, at least so many of them as we would consider and improve our knowledge in, our reason about, and if there be specific ideas of substances, we should endeavour also to make them as complete as we can. Thereby I mean that we should put together as many simple ideas as, being constantly observed to coexist, perfectly determine the species, and each of those simple ideas, which are the ingredients of our complex ones, should be clear and distinct in our minds. For it being evident that our knowledge cannot exceed our ideas, as far as they are either imperfect, confused, or obscure, we cannot expect to have certain perfect or clear knowledge. Secondly, the other is the art of finding out those intermediate ideas which may show us the agreement or repugnancy of the ideas which cannot be immediately compared. That these two, and not the relying on maxims and drawing consequences from some general propositions, are the right methods of improving our knowledge in the ideas of other modes besides those of quantity, the consideration of mathematical knowledge will easily inform us. Where first we shall find that he that has not a perfect and clear idea of those angles or figures of which he desires to know anything is utterly thereby incapable of any knowledge about them. Suppose but a man not to have a perfect exact idea of a right angle, a scalenium or trapezium, and there is nothing more certain than that he will in vain seek any demonstration about them. Further, it is evident that it was not the influence of those maxims which are taken for principles in mathematics that hath led the masters of that science into those wonderful discoveries they have made. Let a man of good parts know all the maxims generally made use of in mathematics ever so perfectly, and contemplate their extent and consequences as much as he pleases, he will by their assistance, I suppose, scarce ever come to know that the square of the hypotenuse in a right-angled triangle is equal to the squares of the two other sides. The knowledge that the whole is equal to all its parts, and if you take equals from equals, the remainder will be equal, etc., helped him not, I presume, to this demonstration, and a man may, I think, pore long enough on those axioms without ever seeing one jot the more of mathematical truths. They have been discovered by the thoughts otherwise applied. The mind had other objects, other views before it, far different from those maxims, when it first got the knowledge of such truths in mathematics, which men, well enough acquainted with those received axioms, but ignorant of their method, who first made these demonstrations, can never sufficiently admire. And who knows what methods to enlarge our knowledge in other parts of science may hereafter be invented, answering that of algebra in mathematics, which so readily finds out the ideas of quantities to measure others by, whose equality or proportion we could otherwise very hardly, or perhaps never, come to know. Chapter 13. some further considerations concerning our knowledge. Our knowledge, as in other things, so in this, has so great a conformity with our sight that it is neither wholly necessary nor wholly voluntary. If our knowledge were altogether necessary, all men's knowledge would not only be alike, but every man would know all that is knowable. And if it were wholly voluntary, some men so little regard or value it that they would have extreme little or none at all. Men that have senses cannot choose but receive some ideas by them, and if they have a memory they cannot but retain some of them, and if they have any distinguishing faculty cannot but perceive the agreement or disagreement of some of them one with another, as he that has eyes, if he will open them by day, cannot but see some objects and perceive a difference in them. But though a man with his eyes open in the light cannot but see, yet there be certain objects which he may choose whether he will turn his eyes to. There may be in his reach a book containing pictures and discourses capable to delight or instruct him, which yet he may never have the will to open, never take the pains to look into. There is also another thing in a man's power, and that is, though he turns his eyes sometimes towards an object, yet he may choose whether he will curiously survey it, and with an intent application endeavour to observe accurately all that is visible in it. But yet what he does see, he cannot see otherwise than he does. It depends not on his will to see that black which appears yellow, nor to persuade himself that what actually scalds him feels cold. The earth will not appear painted with flowers, nor the fields covered with verdure, whenever he has a mind to it. In the cold winter he cannot help seeing it white and hoary if he will look abroad. Just this is it with our understanding. All that is voluntary in our knowledge is the employing or withholding any of our faculties from this or that sort of object, and a more or less accurate survey of them. But they being employed, our will hath no power to determine the knowledge of the mind one way or another. That is done only by the objects themselves, as far as they can clearly be discovered. And therefore, as far as men's senses are conversant about external objects, the mind cannot but receive those ideas which are presented by them, and be informed of the existence of things without. And so far as men's thoughts converse with their own determined ideas, they cannot but in some measure observe the agreement or disagreement that is to be found amongst some of them, which is so far knowledge. And if they have names for those ideas which they have thus considered, they must needs be assured of the truth of those propositions which express that agreement or disagreement they perceive in them, and be undoubtedly convinced of those truths. For what a man sees he cannot but see, and what he perceives he cannot but know that he perceives. Thus he that has got the ideas of numbers, and hath taken the pains to compare 1, 2, and 3 to 6, cannot choose but know that they are equal. He that hath got the idea of a triangle, and found the ways to measure its angles and its magnitudes, is certain that its angles are equal to 2 right ones, and can as little doubt of that as of this truth, that it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. He also that hath the idea of an intelligent but frail and weak being, made by and depending on another who is eternal, omnipotent, perfectly wise and good, will as certainly know that man is to honor, fear, and obey God, as that the sun shines when he sees it. For if he hath but the ideas of 2 such beings in his mind, and will turn his thoughts that way and consider them, he will as certainly find that the inferior, finite, and dependent is under an obligation to obey the supreme and infinite, as he is certain to find that 3, 4, and 7 are less than 15, if he will consider and compute those numbers. Nor can he be surer in a clear morning that the sun is risen, if he will but open his eyes and turn them that way. But yet these truths being ever so certain, ever so clear, he may be ignorant of either or all of them, who will never take the pains to employ his faculties as he should to inform himself about them. Chapter 14 of Judgment. The understanding faculty is being given to man not barely for speculation, but also for the conduct of his life. Man would be at a great loss if he had nothing to direct him but what has the certainty of true knowledge, for that being very short and scanty as we have seen, he would be often utterly in the dark, and in most of the actions of his life perfectly at a stand, had he nothing to guide him in the absence of clear and certain knowledge. He that will not eat till he has demonstration that it will nourish him, he that will not stir till he infallibly knows the business he goes about will succeed, will have little else to do but to sit still and perish. Therefore, as God has set some things in broad daylight, as he has given us some certain knowledge, though limited to a few things in comparison, probably as a taste of what intellectual creatures are capable of, to excite in us a desire and endeavour after a better state, so in the greatest part of our concernments he has afforded us only the twilight, as I may to say, of probability, suitable, I presume, to that state of mediocrity and probationership he has been pleased to place us in here, wherein to check our overconfidence and presumption we might by every day's experience be made sensible of our short-sightedness and liableness to error, the sense whereof might be a constant admonition to us to spend the days of this our pilgrimage with industry and care, in the search and following of that way which might lead us to a state of greater perfection. It being highly rational to think, even were revelation silent in the case, that as men employ those talents God has given them here, they shall accordingly receive their rewards at the close of the day, when their sun shall set and night shall put an end to their labours. The faculty which God has given man to supply the want of clear and certain knowledge in cases where that cannot be had is judgment, whereby the mind takes its ideas to agree or disagree, or, which is the same, any proposition to be true or false, without perceiving a demonstrative evidence in the proofs. The mind sometimes exercises this judgment out of necessity, where demonstrative proofs and certain knowledge are not to be had, and sometimes out of laziness, unskilfulness, or haste, even where demonstrative and certain proofs are to be had. Men often stay not warily to examine the agreement or disagreement of two ideas which they are desirous or concerned to know, but either incapable of such attention as is requisite in a long train of gradations, or impatient of delay, lightly cast their eyes on or wholly pass by the proofs, and so, without making out the demonstration, determine of the agreement or disagreement of two ideas, as it were by a view of them as they are at a distance, and take it to be the one or the other, as seems most likely to them upon such a loose survey. This faculty of the mind, when it is exercised immediately about things, is called judgment. When about truths delivered in words, is most commonly called assent or dissent, which being the most usual way wherein the mind has occasion to employ this faculty, I shall under these terms treat of it as least liable in our language to equivocation. Thus the mind has two faculties conversant about truth and falsehood. First, knowledge, whereby it certainly perceives and is undoubtedly satisfied of the agreement or disagreement of any ideas. Secondly, judgment, which is the putting ideas together or separating them from one another in the mind, when their certain agreement or disagreement is not perceived but presumed to be so, which is, as the world imports, taken to be so before it certainly appears. And if it so unites or separates them as in reality things are, it is right judgment. Chapter 15 of Probability. As demonstration is the showing the agreement or disagreement of two ideas by the intervention of one or more proofs which have a constant, immutable, and visible connection one with another. So probability is nothing but the appearance of such an agreement or disagreement by the intervention of proofs whose connection is not constant and immutable, or at least is not perceived to be so, but it is so appears for the most part to be so, and is enough to induce the mind to judge the proposition to be true or false, rather than the contrary. For example, in the demonstration of it, a man perceives the certain immutable connection there is of equality between the three angles of a triangle and those intermediate ones which are made use of to show their equality to two right ones, and so by an intuitive knowledge of the agreement or disagreement of the intermediate ideas in each step of the progress, the whole series is continued with an evidence which clearly shows the agreement or disagreement of those three angles in equality to two right ones, and thus has certain knowledge that it is so. But another man who never took the pains to observe the demonstration, hearing a mathematician, a man of credit, affirm the three angles of a triangle to be equal to two right ones, assents to it, i.e., receives it for true, in which case the foundation of his assent is the probability of the thing, the proof being such as for the most part carries truth with it, the man on whose testimony he receives it not being wont to affirm anything contrary to or besides his knowledge, especially in matters of this kind, so that that which causes his assent to this proposition that the three angles of a triangle are equal to two right ones, that which makes him take these ideas to agree without knowing them to do so, is the wanted veracity of the speaker in other cases, or his supposed veracity in this. Our knowledge, as has been shown, being very narrow, and we not happy enough to find certain truth in everything which we have occasion to consider, most of the propositions we think, reason, discourse, nigh, act upon are such as we cannot have undoubted knowledge of their truth. Yet some of them border so near upon certainty that we make no doubt at all about them, but assent to them as firmly, and act accordingly to that assent as resolutely, as if they were infallibly demonstrated, and that our knowledge of them was perfect and certain. But there being degrees herein from the very neighborhood of certainty and demonstration quite down to improbability and unlikeness, even to the confines of impossibility, and also degrees of assent from full assurance and confidence quite down to conjecture, doubt, and distrust, I shall come now, having, I think, found out the bounds of human knowledge and certainty, in the next place to consider the several degrees and grounds of probability and assent or faith. Probability is likeness to be true, the very notation of the word signifying such a proposition for which there be arguments or proofs to make it pass or be received for true. The entertainment the mind gives it to pass or be received for true. The entertainment the mind gives this sort of propositions is called belief, assent, or opinion, which is the admitting or receiving any proposition for true upon arguments or proofs that are found to persuade us to receive it as true without certain knowledge that it is so. And herein lies the difference between probability and certainty, faith and knowledge, that in all the parts of knowledge there is intuition. Each immediate idea, each step has its visible and certain connection, and belief not so. That which makes me believe is something extraneous to the thing I believe, something not evidently joined on both sides to, and so not manifestly showing the agreement or disagreement of those ideas that are under consideration. Probability, then, being to supply the defect of our knowledge and to guide us where that fails, is always conversant about propositions whereof we have no certainty, but only some inducements to receive them for true. The grounds of it are, in short, these two following. First, the conformity of anything with our own knowledge, observation, and experience. Secondly, the testimony of others vouching their observation and experience. And the testimony of others is to be considered: 1. The number. 2. Integrity. 3. The skill of the witnesses. 4. The design of the author, where it is a testimony out of a book cited. 5. The consistency of the parts and circumstances of the relation. 6. Contrary testimonies. Probability, wanting that intuitive evidence which infallibly determines the understanding and produces certain knowledge, the mind, if it will proceed rationally, ought to examine all the grounds of probability and see how they make more or less for or against any proposition before it assents to or dissents from it, and upon a due balancing the whole, reject or receive it with a more or less firm assent, proportionably to the preponderancy of the greater grounds of probability on one side or the other. For example, if I myself see a man walk on the ice, it is past probability, it is knowledge. But if another tells me he saw a man in England in the midst of a sharp winter walk upon water hardened with cold, this has so great conformity with what is usually observed to happen that I am disposed by the nature of the thing itself to assent to it, unless some manifest suspicion attend the relation of that matter or fact. But if the same thing be told to one born between the tropics, who never saw nor heard of any such thing before, there the whole probability relies on testimony. And as the relators are more in number and of more credit, and have no interest to speak contrary to the truth, so that matter of fact is like to find more or less belief, though to a man whose experience has always been quite contrary, and who has never heard of anything like it, the most untainted credit of a witness will scarce be able to find belief, as it happened to a Dutch ambassador who, entertaining the King of Siam with the particularities of Holland, which he was inquisitive after, amongst other things told him that the water in his country would sometimes in cold weather be so hard that men walked upon it, and that it would bear an elephant if he was there. To which the king replied, "Hitherto I have believed the strange things you have told me, because I look upon you as a sober fair man, but now I am sure you lie." Upon these grounds depends the probability of any proposition, and as the conformity of our knowledge, as the certainty of observations, as the frequency and constancy of experience, and the number and credibility of testimonies do more or less agree or disagree with it, so is any proposition in itself more or less probable. There is another, I confess, which, though by itself it be no true ground of probability, yet is often made use of for one, by which men most commonly regulate their assent, and upon which they pin their faith more than anything else, and that is the opinions of others. The opinion of others, though there cannot be a more dangerous thing to rely on, nor more likely to mislead one, since there is much more falsehood and error among men than truth and knowledge. And if the opinions and persuasions of others, whom we know and think well of, be a ground of assent, men have reason to be heathens in Japan, Mahometans in Turkey, Papists in Spain, Protestants in England, and Lutherans in Sweden. But of this wrong ground of assent I shall have occasion to speak more at large in another place. Chapter 16 of the Degrees of Assent. The grounds of probability we have laid down in the foregoing chapter, as they are the foundations on which our assent is built, so are they also the measure whereby its several degrees are or ought to be regulated. Only we are to take notice that, whatever grounds of probability there may be, they yet operate no further on the mind, which searches after truth and endeavours to judge right, than they appear, at least in the first judgment or search that the mind makes. I confess, in the opinions men have and firmly stick to in the world, their assent is not always from an actual view of the reasons that at first prevailed with them, it being in many cases almost impossible, and in most very hard, even for those who have very admirable memories, to retain all the proofs which, upon a due examination, made them embrace that side of the question. It suffices that they have once with care and fairness sifted the matter as far as they could, and that they have searched into all the particulars that they could imagine to give any light to the question, and with the best of their skill cast up the account upon the whole evidence. And thus, having once found on which side the probability appeared to them, after as full and exact an inquiry as they can make, they lay up the conclusion in their memories as a truth they have discovered, and for the future they remain satisfied with the testimony of their memories that this is the opinion that, by the proofs they have once seen of it, deserves such a degree of their assent as they afford it. This is all that the greatest part of men are capable of doing in regulating their opinions and judgments, unless a man will exact of them either to retain distinctly in their memories all the proofs concerning any probable truth, and that too in the same order and regular deduction of consequences in which they have formerly placed or seen them, which sometimes is enough to fill a large volume on one single question, or else they must require a man for every opinion that he embraces every day to examine the proofs, both which are impossible. It is unavoidable, therefore, that the memory be relied on in the case, and that men be persuaded of several opinions whereof the proofs are not actually in their thoughts, nigh which perhaps they are not able actually to recall. Without this, the greatest part of men must be either very sceptic or change every moment, and yield themselves up to whoever, having lately studied the question, offers them arguments which, for want of memory, they are not able presently to answer. I cannot but own that men's sticking to their past judgment and adhering firmly to conclusions formerly made is often the cause of great obstinacy and error and mistake, but the fault is not that they rely on their memories for what they have before well judged, but because they judged before they had well examined. May we not find a great number, not to say the greatest part of men, that think they have formed right judgments of several matters, and that for no other reason but because they never thought otherwise, that imagine themselves to have judged right only because they never questioned, never examined their own opinions, which is indeed to think they judged right because they never judged at all. And yet these of all men hold their opinions with the greatest stiffness, those being generally the most fierce and firm in their tenets who have least examined them. What we once know, we are certain is so, and we may be secure that there are no latent proofs undiscovered which may overturn our knowledge or bring it in doubt. But in matters of probability, it is not in every case we can be sure that we have all the particulars before us that any way concern the question, and that there is no evidence behind and yet unseen which may cast the probability on the other side and outweigh all that at present seems to preponderate with us. Who almost is there that hath the leisure, patience, and means to collect together all the proofs concerning most of the opinions he has, so as safely to conclude that he hath a clear and full view, and that there is no more to be alleged for his better information? And yet we are forced to determine ourselves on the one side or other. The conduct of our lives and the management of our great concerns will not bear delay, for those depend for the most part on the determination of our judgment in points wherein we are not capable of certain and demonstrative knowledge, and wherein it is necessary for us to embrace the one side or the other. Since, therefore, it is unavoidable to the greatest part of men, if not all, to have several opinions without certain and indubitable proofs of their truth, and it carries too great an imputation of ignorance, lightness, or folly for men to quit and renounce their former tenets presently upon the offer of an argument which they cannot immediately answer, and show the insufficiency of, it would, methinks, become all men to maintain peace and the common offices of humanity and friendship in the diversity of opinions, since we cannot reasonably expect that anyone should readily and obsequiously quit his own opinion and embrace ours with a blind resignation to an authority which the understanding of man acknowledges not. For however it may often mistake, it can own no other guide but reason, nor blindly submit to the will and dictates of another. If you would bring over to your sentiments be one that examines before he assents, you must give him leave at his leisure to go over the account again, and, recalling what is out of his mind, examine all the particulars to see on which side the advantage lies. And if he will not think our arguments of weight enough to engage him anew in so much pains, it is but what we often do ourselves in the like case, and we should take it amiss if others should prescribe to us what points we should study. And if he be one who takes his opinions upon trust, how can we imagine that he should renounce those tenets which time and custom have so settled in his mind that he thinks them self-evident and of an unquestionable certainty, or which he takes to be impressions he has received from God himself or from men sent by him? How can we expect, I say, that opinions thus settled should be given up to the arguments or authority of a stranger or adversary, especially if there be any suspicion or interest
suspicion of interest or design, as there never fails to be where men find themselves ill-treated. We should do well to commiserate our mutual ignorance and endeavour to remove it in all the gentle and fair ways of information, and not instantly treat others ill and obstinate and perverse because they will not renounce their own and receive our opinions, or at least those we would force upon them, when it is more than probable that we are no less obstinate in not embracing some of theirs. For what is the man that has incontestable evidence of the truth of all that he holds, or of the falsehood of all he condemns, or can say that he has examined to the bottom all his own or other men's opinions? The necessity of believing without knowledge, nigh often upon very slight grounds, in this fleeting state of action and blindness we are in, should make us more busy and careful to inform ourselves than constrain others. At least those who have not thoroughly examined to the bottom all their own tenets must confess they are unfit to prescribe to others, and are unreasonable in imposing that as truth on other men's belief, which they themselves have not searched into, nor weighed the arguments of probability on which they should receive or reject it. Those who have fairly and truly examined, and are thereby got past doubt in all the doctrines they profess and govern themselves by, would have a gesture pretends to require others to follow them. But these are so few in number, and find so little reason to be magisterial in their opinions, that nothing insolent and imperious is to be expected from them, and there is reason to think that if men were better instructed themselves, they would be less imposing on others. But to return to the grounds of assent and the several degrees of it, we are to take notice that the propositions we receive upon inducements of probability are of two sorts, either concerning some particular existence, or, as it is usually termed, matter of fact, which, falling under observation, is capable of human testimony, or else concerning things which, being beyond the discovery of our senses, are not capable of any such testimony. Concerning the first of these, with particular matter of fact, first, where any particular thing consonant to the constant observation of ourselves and others in the like case comes attested by the concurrent reports of all that mention it, we receive it as easily and build as firmly upon it as if it were a certain knowledge, and we reason and act thereupon with a little doubt as if it were perfect demonstration. Thus, if all Englishmen who have occasion to mention it should affirm that it froze in England the last winter, or that there were swallows seen there in the summer, I think a man could almost as little doubt of it as that 7 and 4 are 11. The first, therefore, the highest degree of probability, is when the general consent of all men in all ages, as far as it can be known, concurs with a man's constant and never failing experience in like cases, to confirm the truth of any particular matter of fact attested by fair witnesses. Such are all the stated constitutions and properties of bodies, and the regular proceedings of causes and effects, and the ordinary course of nature. This we call an argument from the nature of things themselves, for what our own and other men's constant observation has found always to be after the same manner, that we with reason conclude to be the effect of steady and regular causes, though they come not within the reach of our knowledge. Thus that fire warmed a man, made lead fluid, and changed the color or consistency in wood or charcoal, that iron sunk in water and swam in quicksilver. These and the like propositions about particular facts being agreeable to our constant experience, as often as we have to do with these matters, and being generally spoke of when mentioned by others as things found constantly to be so, and therefore not so much as controverted by anybody, we are put past doubt that a relation affirming any such thing to have been, or any prediction that it will happen again in the same manner, is very true. These probabilities rise so near to certainty that they govern our thoughts as absolutely, and influence all our actions as fully, as the most evident demonstration, and in what concerns us we make little or no difference between them and certain knowledge. Our belief, thus grounded, rises to assurance. Secondly, the next degree of probability is when I find my
find by my own experience and the agreement of all others that mention it a thing to be for the most part so, and that the particular instance of it is attested by many and undoubted witnesses, v.g. history giving us such an account of men in all ages, and my own experience, as far as I had an opportunity to observe, confirming it, that most men prefer their private advantage to the public. If all historians that write of Tiberius say that Tiberius did so, it is extremely probable, and in this case our assent has a sufficient foundation to raise itself to a degree which we may call confidence. Thirdly, in things that happen indifferently, as that a bird should fly this or that way, that it should thunder on a man's right or left hand, etc., then any particular matter of fact is vouched by the concurrent testimony of unsuspected witnesses, there our assent is also unavoidable. Thus, that there is such a city in Italy as Rome, that about 1,700 years ago there lived in it a man called Julius Caesar, that he was a general, and that he won a battle against another called Pompey. This, though in the nature of the thing there be nothing for nor against it, yet being related by historians of credit and contradicted by no one writer, a man cannot avoid believing it, and can as little doubt of it as he does of the being and actions of his own acquaintance, whereof he himself is a witness. Thus far the matter goes easily enough. Probability upon such grounds carries so much evidence with it that it naturally determines the judgment, and leaves us as little liberty to believe or disbelieve as a demonstration does, whether we will know or be ignorant. The difficulty is when testimonies contradict common experience, and the reports of history and witnesses clash with the ordinary course of nature, or with one another. There it is where diligence, attention, and exactness are required to form a right judgment, and to proportion the assent to the different evidence and probability of the thing, which rises and falls according as those two foundations of credibility with common observation in like cases and particular testimonies in that particular instance favor or contradict it. These are liable to so great variety of contrary observations, circumstances, reports, different qualifications, tempers, designs, oversights, etc. of the reporters, that it is impossible to reduce to precise rules the various degrees wherein men give their assent. This only may be said in general, that as the arguments and proofs pro and con upon due examination, nicely weighing every particular circumstance, shall to anyone appear upon the whole matter in a greater or less degree to preponderate on either side, so they are fitted to produce in the mind such different entertainments as we call belief, conjecture, guess, doubt, wavering, distrust, disbelief, etc. This is what concerns assent in matters wherein testimony is made use of, concerning which I think it may not be amiss to take notice of a rule observed in the law of England, which is that though the attested copy of a record be good proof, yet the copy of a copy, ever so well attested and by ever so credible witnesses, will not be admitted as a proof in judicature. This is so generally approved as reasonable and suited to the wisdom and caution to be used in our inquiry after material truths, that I never yet heard of anyone that blamed it. This practice, if it be allowable in the decisions of right and wrong, carries this observation along with it, viz. That any testimony, the further off it is from the original truth, the less force and proof it has. The being and existence of the thing itself is what I call the original truth. A credible man vouching his knowledge of it is a good proof, but if another equally credible do witness it from his report, the testimony is weaker, and a third that attests the hearsay of an hearsay is yet less considerable, so that in traditional truths each remove weakens the force of the proof, and the more hands the tradition has successively passed through, the less strengthened evidence does it receive from them. This I thought necessary to be taken notice of, because I find amongst some men the quite contrary commonly practiced, who look on opinions to gain force by growing older, and what 1,000 years since would not, to a rational man contemporary with the first voucher, have appeared at all probable, is now urged as certain beyond all question, only because several have since from him said it one after another. Upon this ground, propositions evidently false or doubtful enough to in their first beginning come by an inverted rule of probability to pass for authentic truths, and those which found or deserved little credit from the mouths of their first authors are thought to grow vulnerable by age and are urged as undeniable. I would not be thought here to lessen the credit and use of history. It is all the light we have in many cases, and we receive from it a great part of the useful truths we have with a convincing evidence. I think nothing more valuable than the records of antiquity. I wish we had more of them and more uncorrupted. But this truth itself forces me to say that no probability can rise higher than its first original. What has no other evidence than the single testimony of one only witness must stand or fall by his only testimony, whether good, bad, or indifferent, and though cited afterwards by hundreds of others, one after another, is so far from receiving any strength thereby that it is only the weaker passion, interest, inadvertency, mistake of his meaning, and 1,000 odd reasons, or capricious men's minds are acted by, impossible to be discovered, may make one man quote another man's words or meaning wrong. He that has but ever so little examined the citations of writers cannot doubt how little credit the quotations deserve, where the originals are wanting, and consequently how much less quotations of quotations can be relied on. This is certain, that what in one age was affirmed upon slight grounds can never after come to be more valid in future ages by being often repeated. But the further still it is from the original, the less valid it is, and has always less force in the mouth or writing of him that last made use of it than in his from whom he received it. The probabilities we have hitherto mentioned are only such as concern matter of fact, and such things as are capable of observation and testimony. There remains that other sort concerning which men entertain opinions with variety of assent, though the things be such that, falling not under the reach of our senses, they are not capable of testimony. Such are 1. The existence, nature, and operations of finite and material beings without us, as spirits, angels, devils, etc., or the existence of material beings which, either for their smallness in themselves or remoteness from us, our senses cannot take notice of, as whether there be any plants, animals, and intelligent inhabitants in the planets and other mansions of the vast universe. 2. Concerning the manner of operation in most parts of the works of nature, wherein, though we see the sensible effects, yet their causes are unknown, and we perceive not the ways and manner how they are produced. We see animals are generated, nourished, and move. The lodestone rose iron, and the parts of a candle successively melting turn into flame and give us both light and heat. These and the like effects we see and know, but the causes that operate and the manner they are produced in we can only guess and probably conjecture. For these and the like, coming not within the scrutiny of human senses, cannot be examined by them or be attested by anybody, and therefore can appear more or less probable only as they more or less agree to truths that are established in our minds, and as they hold proportion to other parts of our knowledge and observation. Analogy in these matters is the only help we have, and it is from that alone we draw all our grounds of probability. Thus, observing that the bare rubbing of two bodies violently one upon another produces heat and very often fire itself, we have reason to think that what we call heat and fire consists in a violent agitation of the imperceptible minute parts of the burning matter. Observing likewise that the different refractions of pellucid bodies produce in our eyes the different appearances of several colors, and also that the different ranging and laying the superficial parts of several bodies, as of velvet, watered silk, etc., does the like, we think it probable that the color and shining of bodies is in them nothing but the different arrangement and refraction of their minute and insensible parts. Thus, finding in all parts of the creation that fall under human observation, and that there is a gradual connection of one with another without any great or discernible gaps between, in all that great variety of things we see in the world, which are so closely linked together that in the several ranks of beings, it is not easy to discover the bounds betwixt them. We have reason to be persuaded that by such gentle steps things ascend towards in degrees of perfection. It is a hard matter to say where sensible and rational begin and where insensible and irrational end. And who is there quick-sighted enough to determine precisely which is the lowest species of living things and which the first of those which have no life? Things, as far as we can observe, lessen and augment as the quantity does in a regular cone, where, though there be a manifest odds betwixt the bigness of the diameter at a remote distance, yet the difference between the upper and under, where they touch one another, is hardly discernible. The difference is exceeding great between some men and some animals. But if we will compare the understanding and abilities of some men and some brutes, we shall find so little difference that it will be hard to say that that of the man is either clearer or larger. Observing, I say, such gradual and gentle descents downwards in those parts of the creation that are beneath man, the rule of analogy may make it probable that it is so also in things above us and our observation, and that there are several ranks of intelligent beings excelling us in several degrees of perfection, ascending upwards towards the infinite perfection of the Creator by gentle steps and differences that are every one at no great distance from the next to it. This sort of probability, which is the best conductor of rational experiments and the rise of hypothesis, has also its use and influence, and a very reasoning from analogy leads us often into the discovery of truths and useful productions which would otherwise lie concealed. Though the common experience and the ordinary course of things have justly a mighty influence on the minds of men to make them give or refuse credit to anything proposed to their belief, yet there is one case wherein the strangeness of the fact lessens not the assent to a fair testimony given of it. For where such supernatural events are suitable to ends aimed at by him who has the power to change the course of nature, there, under such circumstances, they may be the fitter to procure belief, by how much the more they are beyond or contrary to ordinary observation. This is the proper case of miracles, which, well attested, do not only find credit themselves, but give in also to other truths which need such confirmation, besides those we have hitherto mentioned. There is one sort of propositions that challenge the highest degree of our assent upon bare testimony, whether the thing proposed agree or disagree with common experience and the ordinary course of things or no. The reason whereof is because the testimony is of such an one as cannot deceive nor be deceived, and that is of God himself. This carries with it an assurance beyond doubt, evidence beyond exception. This is called by a peculiar name revelation, and our assent to it faith, which as absolutely determines our minds and as perfectly excludes all wavering as our knowledge itself. And we may as well doubt of our own being as we can whether by revelation from God be true, so that faith is settled and sure principle of assent and assurance, and leaves no manner of room for doubt or hesitation. Only we must be sure that it be a divine revelation and that we understand it right, else we shall expose ourselves to all the extravagancy of enthusiasm and all the error of wrong principles if we have faith and assurance in what is not divine revelation. And therefore, in those cases, our assent can be rationally no higher than the evidence of its being a revelation, and that this is the meaning of the expressions it is delivered in. If the evidence of its being a revelation, or that this is its true sense, be only on probable proofs, our assent can reach no higher than an assurance or diffidence arising from the more or less apparent probability of the proofs. But of faith and the precedency it ought to have before other arguments of persuasion, I shall speak more hereafter, where I treat of it as it is ordinarily placed in contradistinction to reason, though in truth it be nothing else but an assent founded on the highest reason. Chapter 17 of Reason. The word reason in the English language has different significations. Sometimes it's taken for true and clear principles, sometimes for clear and fair deductions from those principles, and sometimes for the cause and particularly the final cause. But the consideration I shall have of it here is in a signification different from all these. And that is, as it stands for a faculty in man, that faculty whereby man is supposed to be distinguished from beasts, and wherein it is evident he much surpasses them. If general knowledge, as has been shown, consists in a perception of the agreement or disagreement of our own ideas, and the knowledge of the existence of all things without us, except only of a God, whose existence every man may certainly know and demonstrate to himself from his own existence, be had only by our senses, what room is there for the exercise of any other faculty but outward sense and inward perception? What need is there of reason? Very much, both for the enlargement of our knowledge and regulating our assent, for it hath to do both in knowledge and opinion, and is necessary and assisting to all our other intellectual faculties, and indeed contains two of them, viz. Sagacity and elation. By the one it finds out, and by the other it so orders the intermediate ideas as to discover what connection there is in each link of the chain, whereby the extremes are held together, and thereby, as it were, to draw into view the truth sought for, which is that which we call elation or inference, and consists in nothing but the perception of the connection there is between the ideas in each step of the deduction, whereby the mind comes to see either the certain agreement or disagreement of any two ideas as in demonstration, in which it arrives at knowledge, or their probable connection on which it gives or withholds its assent as an opinion. Sense and intuition reach but a very little way. The greatest part of our knowledge depends upon deductions and intermediate ideas, and in those cases where we are fain to substitute assent instead of knowledge, and take propositions for true without being certain they are so, we have need to find out, examine, and compare the grounds of their probability. In both these cases, the faculty which finds out the means and rightly applies them to discover certainty in the one and probability in the other is that which we call reason. For as reason perceives the necessary and indubitable connection of all the ideas, or proves one to another in each step of any demonstration that produces knowledge, so it likewise perceives the probable connection of all the ideas, or proves one to another in every step of a discourse to which it will think assent due. This is the lowest degree of that which can be truly called reason, for where the mind does not perceive this probable connection, where it does not discern whether there be any such connection or no, there men's opinions are not the product of judgment or the consequence of reason, but the effects of chance and hazard of a mind floating at all adventures, without choice and without direction. So that we may in reason consider these 4 degrees. The first and highest is the discovering and finding out of truths. The second, the regular and methodical disposition of them, and laying them in a clear and fit order to make their connection and force be plainly and easily perceived. The third is the perceiving their connection, and the fourth, making a right conclusion. These several degrees may be observed in any mathematical demonstration, it being one thing to perceive the connection of each part as the demonstration is made by another, another to perceive the dependence of the conclusion on all the parts, a third to make out a demonstration clearly and neatly one's self, and something different from all these, to have first found out these intermediate ideas or proofs by which it is made. There is one thing more which I shall desire to be considered concerning reason, and that is, whether syllogism, as is generally thought, be the proper instrument of it, and the usefulest way of exercising this faculty. The causes I have to doubt are these. First, because syllogism serves our reason but in the one only of the forementioned parts of it, and that is to show the connection of the proofs in any one instance, and no more. But in this it is of no great use, since the mind can perceive such connection where it really is, as easily, nay, perhaps better, without it. If we will observe the actings of our own minds, we shall find that we reason best and clearest when we only observe the connection of the proof without reducing our thoughts to any rule of syllogism, and therefore we may take notice that there are many men that reason exceeding clear and rightly, who know not how to make a syllogism. He that will look into many parts of Asia and America will find men reason there perhaps as acutely as himself, who yet never heard of a syllogism, nor can reduce any one argument to those forms, and I believe scarce anyone makes syllogism in reasoning within himself. Indeed, syllogism is made use of on occasion to discover a fallacy hid in a rhetorical flourish, or cunningly wrapped up in a smooth period, and stripping an absurdity of the cover of wit and good language, show it in its naked deformity. But the weakness or fallacy of such a loose discourse it shows by the artificial form it is put into only to those who have thoroughly studied mode and figure, and have so examined the many ways that three propositions may be put together. Indeed, syllogism is made use of on occasion to discover a fallacy hid in a rhetorical flourish, or cunningly wrapped up in a smooth period, and stripping an absurdity of the cover of wit and good language, show it in its naked deformity. But the weakness or fallacy of such a loose discourse it shows by the artificial form it is put into only to those who have thoroughly studied mode and figure, and have so examined the many ways that three propositions may be put together, as to know which of them does certainly conclude right and which not, and upon what grounds it is that they do so. All who have so far considered syllogism as to see the reason why in three propositions laid together in one form the conclusion will be certainly right, but in another not certainly so, I grant, are certain of the conclusion they draw from the premises in the allowed notes and allowed modes and figures. But they who have not so far looked into those forms are not sure, by virtue of syllogism, that the conclusion certainly follows from the premises. They only take it to be so by an implicit faith in their teachers and a confidence in those forms of argumentation. But this is still but believing, not being certain. Now, if of all mankind those who can make syllogisms are extremely few in comparison of those who cannot, and if of those few who have been taught logic there is but a very small number who do any more than believe that syllogisms in the allowed modes and figures do conclude right, without knowing certainly that they do so. If syllogisms must be taken for the only proper instrument of reason and means of knowledge, it will follow that before Aristotle there was not one man that did or could know anything by reason, and that since the invention of syllogisms there is not one of 10,000 that doth. But God has not been so sparing to men to make them barely two-legged creatures, and left it to Aristotle to make them rational, i.e., those few of them that he could get, so to examine the grounds of syllogisms, as to see that in above 60 ways that three propositions may be laid together, there are but about 14 wherein one may be sure that the conclusion is right, and upon what grounds it is that in these few the conclusion is certain and in the other not. God has been more bountiful to mankind, and so he has given them a mind that can reason without being instructed in methods of syllogizing. The understanding is not taught to reason by these rules. It has a native faculty to perceive the coherence or incoherence of its ideas, and can range them right without any such perplexing repetitions. I say not this any way to lessen Aristotle, whom I look on as one of the greatest men amongst the ancients, whose large views, acuteness and penetration of thought and strength of judgment few have equalled, and who, in this very invention of forms of argumentation wherein the conclusion may be shown to be rightly inferred, did great service against those who were not ashamed to deny anything. And I readily won that all right reasoning may be reduced to his forms of syllogism, but yet I think without any diminution to him I may truly say that they are not the only or nor the best way of reasoning, for the leading of those into truth who are willing to find it and desire to make the best use they may of their reason for the attainment of knowledge. And he himself, it is plain, found out some forms to be conclusive and others not by the forms themselves, but by the original way of knowledge, i.e., by the visible agreement of ideas. Tell a country gentlewoman that the wind is southwest and the weather lowering and like to rain, and she will easily understand it is not safe for her to go abroad thin-clad in such a day after a fever. She clearly sees the probable connection of all these with southwest wind and clouds, rain, wetting, taking cold, relapse, and danger of death, without tying them together in those artificial and cumbersome fetters of several syllogisms that clog and hinder the mind, which proceeds from one part to another quicker and clearer without them, and the probability which she easily perceives in things thus in their native state would be quite lost if this argument were managed learnedly and proposed in mode and figure. For it very often confounds the connection, and I think everyone will perceive in mathematical demonstrations that the knowledge gained thereby comes shortest and clearest without syllogism. Inference is looked on as the great act of the rational faculty, and so it is when it is rightly made. But the mind, either very desirous to enlarge its knowledge or very apt to favour the sentiments it has once imbibed, is very forward to make inferences, and therefore often makes too much haste before it perceives the connection of the ideas that must hold the extremes together. To infer is nothing but by virtue of one proposition laid down as true to draw in another as true, i.e., to see or suppose such connection of the two ideas of the inferred proposition, e.g., let this be the proposition laid down, men shall be punished in another world, and from thence be inferred this other, then men can determine themselves. The question now is to know whether the mind has made this inference right or no. If it has made it by finding out the intermediate ideas and taking a view of the connection of them placed in a due order, it has proceeded rationally and made a right inference. If it has done it without such a view, it has not so much made an inference that will hold, or an inference of right reason, as shown a willingness to have it to be or be taken from such. But in neither case is it syllogism that discovered those ideas or showed the connection of them, for they must be both found out and the connection everywhere perceived before they can rationally be made use of in syllogism, unless it can be said that any idea, without considering what connection it hath with the two other whose agreement should be shown by it, will do well enough in a syllogism, and may be taken at a venture for the medius terminus to prove any conclusion. But this nobody will say, because it is by virtue of the perceived agreement of the intermediate idea with the extremes that the extremes are concluded to agree, and therefore each intermediate idea must be such as in the whole chain hath a visible connection with those two it has been placed between, or else thereby the conclusion cannot be inferred or drawn in. For wherever any link of the chain is loose and without connection, there the whole strength of it is lost, and it hath no force to infer or draw in anything. In the instance above mentioned, what is it shows the force of the inference, and consequently the reasonableness of it, but a view of the connection of all the intermediate ideas that draw in the conclusion or proposition inferred, e.g., men shall be punished, God the punisher, just punishment, the punished guilty, could have done otherwise. Freedom and self-determination, by which chain of ideas thus visibly linked together in train, i.e., each intermediate idea agreeing on each side with those two it is that immediately placed between the ideas of men and self-determination appear to be connected, i.e., this proposition, men can determine themselves, is drawn in or inferred from this, that they shall be punished in the other world. For here the mind, seeing the connection there is between the idea of men's punishment in the other world and the idea of God punishing, between God punishing and the justice of the punishment, between justice of punishment and guilt, between guilt and the power to do otherwise, between a power to do otherwise and freedom, and between freedom and self-determination, sees the connection between men and self-determination. Now I ask, whether the connection of the extremes be not more clearly seen in this simple and natural disposition than in the perplexed repetitions and jumble of 5 or 6 syllogisms. I must beg pardon for calling it jumbles until somebody shall put these ideas into so many syllogisms, and then say that they are less jumbled and their connection more visible when they are transposed and repeated and spun out to a great length in artificial forms, than in that short and natural plain order they are laid down in here, wherein everyone may see it, and wherein they must be seen before they can be put into a train of syllogisms. For the natural order of the connecting ideas must direct the order of the syllogisms, and a man must see the connection of each intermediate idea with those that it connects, before he can with reason make use of it in a syllogism. And when all those syllogisms are made, neither those that are nor those that are not logicians will see the force of the argumentation, i.e., the connection of the extremes, one jot the better. For those that are not men of art, not knowing the true forms of syllogism, nor the reasons of them, cannot know whether they are made in right and conclusive modes and figures or no, and so are not at all helped by the forms they are put into, though by them the natural order wherein the mind could judge of their respective connection being disturbed renders the elation much more uncertain than without them. And as for the logicians themselves, they see the connection of each intermediate idea with those it stands between, on which the force of the inference depends, as well before as after the syllogism is made, or else they do not see it at all. For a syllogism neither shows nor strengthens the connection of any two ideas immediately put together, but only by the connection seen in them shows what connection the extremes have one with another. But what connection the intermediate has with either of the extremes in the syllogisms, that no syllogism does or can show, that the mind only doth or can perceive as much as they stand there in the juxtaposition by its own view, to which the syllogistical form it happens to be in gives no help to light at all. It only shows that if the intermediate idea agrees with those it is on both sides immediately applied to, then those two remote ones, or as they are called extremes, do certainly agree, and therefore the immediate connection of each idea to that which it is applied to on each side, on which the force of the reasoning depends, is as well seen before as after the syllogism is made, or else he that makes the syllogism could never see it at all. This, as has been already observed, is seen only by the eye or the perceptive faculty of the mind, taking a view of them laid together in a juxtaposition, which view of any two it has equally whenever they are laid together in any proposition, whether that proposition be placed as a major or a minor in a syllogism or no. Of what use, then, are syllogisms? I answer, their chief and main use is in the schools, where men are allowed without shame to deny the agreement of ideas that do manifestly agree, or out of the schools to those who from thence have learned without shame to deny the connection of ideas which even to themselves is visible. But to an ingenuous searcher after truth, who has no other aim but to find it, there is no need of any such form to force the alloying of the inference. The truth and reasonableness of it is better seen in ranging of the ideas in a simple and plain order, and hence it is that men in their own inquiries after truth never use syllogisms to convince themselves, or in teaching others to instruct willing learners, because before they can put them into a syllogism, they must see the connection that is between the intermediate idea and two other ideas it is set between and applied to show their agreement. And when they see that, they see whether the inference be good or no. And no syllogism comes too late to settle it. For to make use again the former instance, I ask whether the mind, considering the idea of justice, placed as an intermediate idea between the punishment of men and the guilt of the punished, until it does so consider it, the mind cannot make use of it as a medius terminus, does not plainly see the force and strength of the inference as when it is formed into a syllogism. To show it in a very plain and easy example, let animal be the intermediate idea or medius terminus that the mind makes use of to show the connection of homo and vivens. I ask whether the mind does not more readily and plainly see that connection in the simple and proper position of the connecting idea in the middle, thus homo animo vivens, than in this perplexed one, animal vivens homo animo, which is the position these ideas have in a syllogism to show the connection between homo and vivens by the intervention of animal. Indeed, syllogism is thought to be of necessary use even to the lovers of truth to show them the fallacies that are often concealed in florid, witty, or involved discourses. But that this is a mistake will appear if we consider that the reason why sometimes men who sincerely aim at truth are imposed upon by such loose and, as they are called, rhetorical discourses is that their fancies being struck with some lively metaphorical representations, they neglect to observe or do not easily perceive what are the true ideas upon which the inference depends. Now, to show such men the weakness of such an argumentation, there needs no more but to strip it of the superfluous ideas which, blended and confounded with those on which the inference depends, seem to show a connection where there is none, or at least to hinder the discovery of the want of it, and then to lay the naked ideas on which the force of the argumentation depends on their due order, in which position the mind, taking a view of them, sees what connection they have, and so is able to judge of the inference without any need of a syllogism at all. I grant that mode and figure is commonly made use of in such cases, as if the detection of the incoherence of such loose discourses were wholly owing to the syllogistical form, and so I myself formerly thought, till upon a stricter examination I now find that laying the intermediate ideas naked in their due order shows the incoherence of the argumentation better than syllogism, not only as subjecting each link of the chain to the immediate view of the mind in its proper place whereby its connection is best observed, but also because syllogism shows the incoherence only to those who are not one of 10,000 who perfectly understand mode and figure, and the reason upon which those forms are established, whereas a due and orderly placing of the ideas upon which the inference is made makes everyone, whether logician or not logician, who understands the terms and hath the faculty and perceive the agreement or disagreement of such ideas, without which in or out of syllogism he cannot perceive the strength or weakness, coherence or incoherence of the discourse, see the want of connection in the argumentation and the absurdity of the inference. And this I have known a man unskilful in syllogism, who at first hearing could perceive the weakness and inconclusiveness of a long artificial and plausible discourse, wherewith others better skilled in syllogism have been misled, and I believe there are few of my readers who do not know such. And indeed, if it were not so, the debates of most princes' councils and the business of assemblies would be in danger to be mismanaged, since those who are relied upon and have usually a great stroke in them are not always such who have the good luck to be perfectly knowing in the forms of syllogism, or expert in mode and figure. And if syllogism were the only, or so much as the surest way to detect the fallacies of artificial discourses, I do not think that all mankind, even princes in matters that concern their crowns and dignities, are so much in love with falsehood and mistake that they would everywhere have neglected to bring syllogism into the debates of moment, or thought it ridiculous so much as to offer them in affairs of consequence. A plain evidence to me that men of parts and penetration, who were not idly to dispute at their ease, but were to act according to the result of their debates, and often pay for their mistakes with their heads or fortunes, found those scholastic forms were of little use to discover truth or fallacy, whilst both the one and the other might be shown and better shown without them, to those who would not refuse to see what was visibly shown them. Secondly, another reason that makes me doubt whether syllogism be the only proper instrument of reason in the discovery of truth is that of whatever use modern figure is pretended to be in the laying open of fallacy, which has been above considered, those scholastic forms of discourse are not less liable to fallacies than the plainer ways of argumentation, and for this I appeal to common observation, which has always found these artificial methods of reasoning more adapted to catch and entangle the mind than to instruct and inform the understanding. And hence it is that men, even when they are baffled and silenced in this scholastic way, are seldom or never convinced, and so brought over to the conquering side, they perhaps acknowledge their adversary to be the more skilful disputant. The rest, nevertheless, persuaded of the truth on their side, and go away, worsted as they are with the same opinion they brought with them, which they could not do if this way of argumentation carried light and conviction with it, and made men see where the truth lay, and therefore syllogism has been thought more proper for the attaining victory in dispute than for the discovery or confirmation of truth in fair inquiries. And if it be certain that fallacies can be couched in syllogism, as it cannot be denied, it must be something else, and not syllogism, that must discover them. I have had experience how ready some men are, when all the use which they have been wont to ascribe to anything is not allowed, to cry out that I am for laying it wholly aside. But to prevent such unjust and groundless imputations, I tell them that I am not for taking away any helps in the understanding in that attainment of knowledge, and if men skilled in and used to syllogisms find them assisting to their reason in the discovery of truth, I think they ought to make use of them. All that I aim at is that they should not ascribe more to these forms than belongs to them, and think that men have no use or not so full an use of their reasoning faculties without them. Some eyes want spectacles to see things clearly and distinctly, but let not those that use them therefore say nobody can see clearly without them. Those who do so will be thought in favor of art, which perhaps they are beholden to a little too much to depress and discredit nature. Reason, by its own penetration, where it is strong and exercised, usually sees quicker and clearer without syllogism. If use of those spectacles has so dimmed its sight that it cannot without them see consequences or inconsequences in argumentation, I am not so unreasonable as to be against the using them. Everyone knows what best fits his own sight, but let him not thence conclude all in the dark, who use not just the same helps that he finds a need of, but however it be in knowledge, I think I may truly say it is of far less or no use at all in probabilities, for the assent there being to be determined by the preponderancy after due weighing of all the proofs, with all circumstances on both sides, nothing is so unfit to assist the mind in that as syllogism, which, running away with one assumed probability or one topical argument, pursues that till it has led the mind quite out of sight of the thing under consideration, and forcing it upon some remote difficulty, holds it fast there, entangled perhaps, and as it were manacled in the chain of syllogisms, without allowing it the liberty, much less affording it the helps requisite to show on which side, all things considered, is the greater probability. But let it help us, as perhaps may be said, in convincing men of their errors and mistakes, and yet I would fain see the man that was forced out of his opinion by dint of syllogism, yet still it fails our reason in that part which, if not its highest perfection, is yet certainly its hardest task, and that which we most need its help in, and that is the finding out of proofs and making new discoveries. The rules of syllogism serve not to furnish the mind with those intermediate ideas that may show the connection of remote ones, This way of reasoning discovers no new proofs, but is the art of marshalling and ranging the old ones we have already. The 47th proposition of the first book of Euclid is very true, but the discovery of it, I think, not owing to any rules of common logic. A man knows first, and then he is able to prove syllogistically, so that syllogism comes after knowledge, and then a man has little or no need of it. But it is chiefly by the finding out those ideas that show the connection of distant ones that our stock of knowledge is increased and that useful arts and sciences are advanced. Syllogism at best is but the art of fencing with the little knowledge we have without making any addition to it. As if a man should employ his reason all this way, he will not do much otherwise than he who, having got some iron out of the bowels of the earth, should have it beaten up all into swords and put it into his servants' hands to fence with and bang one another. Had the King of Spain employed the hands of his people and his Spanish iron, so he had brought to light but little of that treasure that lay so long hid in the dark entrails of America. And I am apt to think that he who shall employ all the force of his reason only in brandishing of syllogisms will discover on very little of that mass of knowledge which lies yet concealed in the secret recesses of nature, and which I am apt to think native rustic reason, as it formerly has done, is likelier to open a way to and add to the common stock of mankind rather than any scholastic proceeding by the strict rules of mode and figure. I doubt not, nevertheless, but there are ways to be found to assist our reason in this most useful part, and this the judicious Hooker encourages me to say, who in his speaks thus: if there might be added the right helps of true art and learning, which helps, I must plainly confess, this age of the world, carrying the name of a learned age, doth neither much know nor generally regard, there would undoubtedly be almost as much difference in maturity of judgment between men therewith inured, and that which men now are, as between men that are now and innocents. I do not pretend to have found or discovered here any of those right helps of art this great man of deep thought mentions, but that is plain that syllogism and the logic now in use, which were as well known in his days, can be none of those he means. It is sufficient for me if by a discourse, perhaps something out of the way, am sure, as to me wholly new and unborrowed, I shall have given occasion to others to cast about for new discoveries, and to seek in their own thoughts for those right helps of art, which will scarce be found, I fear, by those who servilely confine themselves to the rules and dictates of others. For beaten tracks lead this sort of cattle, as an observing Roman calls them, whose thoughts reach only to imitation, non quo evendum est, sed quo itur. But I can be bold to say that this age is adorned with some men of that strength of judgment and largeness of comprehension that, if they would employ their thoughts on this subject, could open new and undiscovered ways to the advancement of knowledge. Having here had occasion to speak of syllogism in general and the use of it in reasoning and the improvement of our knowledge, it is fit, therefore, I leave this subject to take notice of one manifest mistake in the rules of syllogism, viz., that no syllogistical reasoning can be right and conclusive but what has at least one general proposition in it, as if we could not reason and have knowledge about particulars. Whereas in truth, the matter, rightly considered, the immediate object of all our reasoning and knowledge is nothing but particulars. Every man's reasoning and knowledge is only about the ideas existing in his own mind, which are truly, every one of them, particular existences, and our knowledge and reason about other things is only as they correspond with those particular ideas. So that the perception of the agreement or disagreement of our particular ideas is the whole and most of all our knowledge. Universality is but accidental to it, and consists only in this, that the particular ideas about which it is are such as more than one particular thing can correspond with and be represented by, but the perception of the agreement or disagreement of any two ideas, and consequently our knowledge, is equally clear and certain whether either or both or neither of those ideas be capable of representing more real beings than one or no. One thing more I crave leave to offer about syllogism before I leave it, viz., may one not upon just ground inquire whether the form syllogism now has is that which in reason it ought to have, for the medius terminus being to join the extremes, i.e. the intermediate ideas, by its intervention to show the agreement or disagreement of the two in question. Would not the position of the medius terminus be more natural and show the agreement or disagreement of the extremes clearer and better if it were placed in the middle between them, which might be easily done by transposing the propositions and making the medius terminus the predicate of the first and the subject of the second, as thus: omnis homo est animo, omne animo est vivens, ergo omnis homo est vivens, omne corpus est extensum et solidum, nullum extensum et solidum est pura extensio, ergo corpus non est pura extensio. I need not trouble my reader with instances and syllogisms whose conclusions are particular. The same reason hold for the same form in them as well as in the general. Reason, though it penetrates into the depths of the sea and earth, elevates our thoughts as high as the stars and leads us through the vast spaces and large rooms of this mighty fabric, yet it comes far short of the real extent of even corporeal being, and there are many instances wherein it fails us as: first, it perfectly fails us where our ideas fail. It neither does nor can extend itself further than they do, and therefore wherever we have no ideas, our reasoning stops and we are at an end of our reckoning. And if at any time we reason about words which do not stand for any ideas, it is only about those sounds and nothing else. Secondly, our reason is often puzzled and at a loss because the obscurity, confusion, or imperfection of the ideas it is employed about, and there we are involved in difficulties and contradictions. Thus, not having any perfect idea of the least extension of matter nor of infinity, we are at a loss about the divisibility of matter, but having perfect, clear, and distinct ideas of number, our reason meets with none of those inextricable difficulties in numbers, nor finds itself involved in any contradictions about them. Thus, we having but imperfect ideas of the operations of our minds and of the beginning of motion or thought, how the mind produces either of them in us, and much imperfecter yet of the operation of God, run into great difficulties about free created agents, which reason cannot well extricate itself out of. Thirdly, our reason is often at a stand because it perceives not those ideas which could serve to show the certain or probable agreement or disagreement of any other two ideas, and in this some men's faculties far outgo others, till algebra, that great instrument and instance of human sagacity, was discovered. Men with amazement looked on several of the demonstrations of ancient mathematicians, and could scarce forbear to think the finding several of those proofs to be something more than human. Fourthly, the mind, by proceeding upon false principles, is often engaged in absurdities and difficulties, brought into straits and contradictions, without knowing how to free itself, and in that case it is in vain to implore the help of reason, unless it be to discover the falsehood and reject the influence of those wrong principles. Reason is so far from clearing the difficulties which the building upon false foundations bring a man into, that if he will pursue it, it entangles him the more and engages him deeper in perplexities. Fifthly, as obscure and imperfect ideas often involve our reason, so upon the same ground do dubious words and uncertain signs, often in discourses and arguings, when not warily attended to, puzzle men's reason and bring them to a nonplus. But these two latter are our fault, and not the fault of reason, but yet the consequences of them are nevertheless obvious, and the perplexities or errors they fill men's minds with are everywhere observable. Some of the ideas that are in the mind are so there that they can be by themselves immediately compared one with another, and in these the mind is able to perceive that they agree or disagree as clearly as that it has them. Thus the mind perceives that an arc of a circle is less than the whole circle as clearly as it does the idea of a circle. And this, therefore, as has been said, I call intuitive knowledge, which is certain beyond all doubt and needs no probation, nor can have any. This being the highest of all human certainty, in this consists the evidence of all those maxims which nobody has any doubt about, but every man does not, as is said, only assent to, but knows to be true as soon as ever they are proposed to his understanding. In the discovery of and assent to these truths there is no use of the discursive faculty, no need of reasoning, but they are known by a superior and higher degree of evidence. And such, if I may guess at things unknown, I am apt to think that angels have now, and the spirits of just men made perfect shall have in a future state of thousands of things which now either wholly escape our apprehensions, or which our short-sighted reason, having got some faint glimpse of, we in the dark grope after. But though we have here and there a little of this clear light, some sparks of bright knowledge, yet the greatest part of our ideas are such that we cannot discern their agreement or disagreement by an immediate comparing them, and in all these we have need of reasoning, and must by discourse and inference make our discoveries. Now of these there are two sorts, which I shall take the liberty to mention here again. First, those whose agreement or disagreement, though it cannot be seen by an immediate putting them together, yet may be examined by the intervention of other ideas which can be compared with them. In this case, when the agreement or disagreement of the intermediate idea on both sides with those which we would compare is plainly discerned, that it amounts to demonstration whereby knowledge is produced, which, though it be certain, yet it is not so easy nor altogether so clear as intuitive knowledge, because in that there is barely one simple intuition, wherein there is no room for any the least mistake or doubt. The truth is seen all perfectly at once. In demonstration, it is true, there is intuition too, but not altogether at once. But there must be a remembrance of the intuition of the agreement of the medium or intermediate idea with that we compare it with before, when we compare it with the other. And where there be many mediums, there the danger of the mistake is the greater, for each agreement or disagreement of the ideas must be observed and seen in each step of the whole train, and retained in the memory just as it is, and the mind must be sure that no part of what is necessary to make up the demonstration is omitted or overlooked. This makes some demonstrations long and perplexed, and too hard for those who have not strength of parts distinctly to perceive and exactly carry so many particulars orderly in their heads. And even those who are able to master such intricate speculations are fain sometimes to go over them again, and there is need of more than one review before they can arrive at certainty. But yet, where the mind clearly retains the intuition it had of the agreement of any idea with another, and that with a third, and that with a fourth, etc., there the agreement of the first and the fourth is a demonstration, and produces certain knowledge, which may be called rational knowledge, as the other is intuitive. Secondly, there are other ideas whose agreement or disagreement can no otherwise be judged of but by the intervention of others, which have not a certain agreement with the extremes, but an unusual or likely one. And in these it is that the judgment is properly exercised, which is the acquiescing of the mind that any ideas do agree by comparing them with such probable mediums. This, though it never amounts to knowledge, no, not to that which is the lowest degree of it, yet sometimes the intermediate ideas tie the extremes so firmly together, and the probability is so clear and strong that assent as necessarily follows it as knowledge does demonstration. The great excellency and use of the judgment is to observe right and take a true estimate of the force and weight of each probability, then casting them up all right together, choose that side which has the overbalance. Intuitive knowledge is the perception of the certain agreement or disagreement of the two ideas immediately compared together. Rational knowledge is the perception of the certain agreement or disagreement of any two ideas by the intervention of one or more other ideas. Judgment is the thinking or taking two ideas to agree or disagree by the intervention of one or more ideas whose certain agreement or disagreement with them it does not perceive but hath observed to be frequent and usual. Though the deducing one proposition from another, or making inferences in words, be a great part of reason, and that which it is usually employed about, yet the principal act of ratiocination is the finding the agreement or disagreement of two ideas one with another by the intervention of a third. As a man by a yard finds two houses to be of the same length which could not be brought together to measure their equality by juxtaposition, words have their consequences as the signs of such ideas, and things agree or disagree as really they are, but we observe it only by our ideas. Before we quit this subject, it may be worth our while a little to reflect on four sorts of arguments that men, in their reasonings with others, do ordinarily make use of to prevail on their assent, or at least to awe them as to silence their opposition. The first is to allege the opinions of men whose parts, learning, eminency, power, or some other cause has gained a name and settled their reputation in the common esteem with some kind of authority. When men are established in any kind of dignity, it is thought a breach of modesty for others to derogate any way from it. They question the authority of men who are in possession of it. This is apt to be censured as carrying with it too much pride, when a man does not readily yield to the determination of approved authors, which is wont to be received with respect and submission by others. And it is looked upon as insolence for a man to set up and adhere to his own opinion against the current stream of antiquity, or to put it in the balance against that of some learned doctor or otherwise approved writer. Whoever backs his tenets with such authorities thinks he ought thereby to carry the cause, and is ready to style it impudence in any one who shall stand out against them. This, I think, may be called argumentum ad verecundiam. Secondly, another way that men ordinarily use to drive others and force them to submit to their judgments and receive their opinion in debate is to require the adversary to admit what they allege as a proof, but to assign a better, and this I call argumentum ad ignorantium. Thirdly, a third way is to press a man with consequences drawn from his own principles or concessions. This is already known under the name of argumentum ad hominem. Fourthly, the fourth is the using of proofs drawn from any of the foundations of knowledge or probability. This I call argumentum ad judicium. This alone of all the four brings true instruction with it and advances us in our way to knowledge. For one, it argues not another man's opinion to be right, because I, out of respect or any other consideration but that of conviction, will not contradict him. 2. It proves not another man to be in the right way, nor that I ought to take the same with him, because I know not a better. Nor does it follow that another man is in the right way, because he has shown me that I am now in the wrong. I may be modest and therefore not oppose another man's persuasion. I may be ignorant and not be able to produce a better. I may be in an error, and another may show me that I am so. This may dispose me, perhaps, for the perception of truth, but helps me not to it. That must come from proofs and arguments and light arising from the nature of things themselves, and not from any shamefacedness, ignorance, or error. But what has been before said of reason, we may be able to make some guess at the distinction of things into those that are according to, above, and contrary to reason. 1. According to reason are such propositions whose truth we can discover by examining and tracing those ideas we have from sensation and reflection, and by natural deduction find to be true or probable. 2. Above reason are such propositions whose truth or probability we cannot by reason derive from those principles. Contrary to reason are such propositions as are inconsistent with or irreconcilable to our clear and distinct ideas. Thus the existence of one God is according to reason the existence of more than one God, contrary to reason the resurrection of the dead above reason. Further, as above reason also may be taken in a double sense, viz. Either as signifying above probability or above certainty. So in that large sense also, contrary to reason, it is I suppose, sometimes taken. There is another use of the word reason, wherein it is opposed to faith, which, though it be in itself a very improper way of speaking, yet common use has so authorized it that it would be folly either to oppose or hope to remedy it. Only I think it may not be amiss to take notice that, however faith be opposed to reason, faith is nothing but a firm assent of the mind, which, if it be regulated, as is our duty, cannot be afforded to anything but upon good reason, and so cannot be opposite to it. He that believes without having any reason for believing may be in love with his own fancies, but neither seeks truth as he ought, nor pays the obedience due to his Maker, who would have him use those discerning faculties he has given him to keep him out of mistake and error. He that does not this to the best of his power, however he sometimes lights on truth, is in the right but by chance, and I know not whether the luckiness of the accident will excuse the irregularity of his proceeding. This at least is certain, that he must be accountable for whatever mistakes he runs into, whereas he that makes use of the lightened faculties the God has given him, and seeks sincerely to discover truth by those helps and abilities he has, may have this satisfaction in doing his duty as a rational creature, that though he shall miss truth, he will not miss the reward of it, for he governs his assent right, and places it as he should, who, in any case or matter whatsoever, believes or disbelieves according as reason directs him. He that doth otherwise transgresses against his own light, and misuses those faculties which were given him to no other end but to search and follow the clearer evidence and greater probability. But since reason and faith are by some men opposed, we will so consider them in the following chapter. Chapter 18 of Faith and Reason and their distinct provinces. It has been above shown, 1. That we are of necessity ignorant and want knowledge of all sorts where we want ideas. 2. That we are ignorant and want rational knowledge where we want proofs. 3. That we want certain knowledge and certainty as far as we want clear and determined specific ideas. 4. That we want probability to direct our assent in matters where we have neither knowledge of our own nor testimony of other men to bottom our reason upon. From these things thus premised, I think we may come to lay down the measures and boundaries between faith and reason, the wound whereof may possibly have been the cause, if not of great disorders, yet at least of great disputes and perhaps mistakes in the world. For till it be resolved how far we are to be guided by reason and how far by faith, we shall in vain dispute and endeavor to convince one another in matters of religion. I find every sect, as far as reason will help them, make use of it gladly, and what it fails them they cry out, it is a matter of faith and above reason. And I do not see how they can argue with anyone, or even convince a gainsayer who makes use of the same plea without setting down strict boundaries between faith and reason, which ought to be the first point established in all questions where faith has anything to do. Reason, therefore, here, as contradistinguished to faith, I take to be the discovery of the certainty or probability of such propositions or truths which the mind arrives at by deduction made from such ideas which it has got by the use of its natural faculties, with by sensation or reflection. Faith on the other side, is the asset to any proposition not thus made out by the deductions of reason, but upon the credit of the proposer as coming from God in some extraordinary way of communication. This way of discovering truths to man we call revelation. First, then, I say that no man inspired by God can by any revelation communicate to others any new simple ideas which they had not before from sensation or reflection. For whatsoever impressions he himself may have from the immediate hand of God, this revelation, if it be of new simple ideas, cannot be conveyed to another either by words or any other signs, because words, by their immediate operation on us, cause no other ideas but of their natural sounds, and it is by the custom of using them for signs that they excite and revive in our minds latent ideas, but yet only such ideas as were there before. For words, seen or heard, recall to our thoughts those ideas only which to us they have been wont to be signs of, but cannot introduce any perfectly new and formerly unknown simple ideas. The same holds in all other signs which cannot signify to us things of which we have before never had any idea at all. Thus, whatever things were discovered to Saint Paul when he was wrapped up into the third heaven, whatever new ideas his mind there received, all the description he can make to others of that place is only this, that there are such things as eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, nor hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive. And supposing God should discover to anyone supernaturally a species of creatures inhabiting, for example, Jupiter or Saturn, for that it is possible there may be such, nobody can deny, which had six senses, and imprint on his mind the ideas conveyed to theirs by that sixth sense, he could no more by words produce in the minds of other men those ideas imprinted by that sixth sense than one of us could convey the idea of any color by the sound of words into a man who, having the other four senses perfect, had always totally wanted the fifth of seeing. For our simple ideas, then, which are the foundation and sole matter of all our notions and knowledge, we must depend wholly on our reason, I mean our natural faculties, and can by no means receive them, or any of them, from traditional revelation. I say traditional revelation in distinction to original revelation. By the one, I mean that first impression which is made immediately by God on the mind of any man, to which we cannot set any bounds, and by the other, those impressions delivered over to others in words and the ordinary ways of conveying our conceptions one to another. Secondly, I say that the same truths may be discovered and conveyed down from revelation, which are discoverable to us by reason and by those ideas we naturally may have. So God might, by revelation, discover the truth of any proposition in Euclid, as well as men, by the natural use of their faculties, come to make the discovery themselves. In all things of this kind there is little need or use of revelation, God having furnished us with natural and surer means to arrive at the knowledge of them. For whatsoever truth we come to the clear discovery of from the knowledge and contemplation of our own ideas will always be set in act to us than those which are conveyed to us by traditional revelation. For the knowledge we have that this revelation came at first from God can never be so sure as the knowledge we have from the clear and distinct perception of the agreement or disagreement of our own ideas. V.g., if it were revealed some ages since that the three angles of a triangle were equal to two right ones, I might assent to the truth of that proposition upon the credit of the tradition that it was revealed, but that would never amount to so great a certainty as the knowledge of it upon the comparing and measuring my own ideas of two right angles and the three angles of a triangle. The like holds in matter of fact, knowable by our senses, v.g., the history of the deluge is conveyed to us by writings which had their original from revelation, and yet nobody, I think, will say he has as certain and clear a knowledge of the flood as Noah. That said, or that he himself would have had he then been alive and seen it. For he has no greater an assurance than that of his senses, that is writ in the book supposed writ by Moses inspired. But he has not so great an assurance that Moses wrote that book as if he had seen Moses write it, so that the assurance of its being a revelation is less still than the assurance of his senses. In proposition, then, whose certainty is built upon the clear perception of the agreement or disagreement of our ideas attained either by immediate intuition, as in self-evident propositions, or by evident deductions of reason in demonstrations, we need not the assistance of revelation as necessary to gain our assent and introduce them into our minds, because the natural ways of knowledge could settle them there, or had done it already, which is the greatest assurance we can possibly have of anything, unless where God immediately reveals it to us, and thereto our assurance can be no greater than our knowledge is, that it is a revelation from God, but yet nothing, I think, can under that title shake or overrule plain knowledge, or rationally prevail with any man to admit it for true, in a direct contradiction to the clear evidence of his own understanding. For since no evidence of our faculties by which we receive such revelations can exceed it, if equal the certainty of our intuitive knowledge, we can never receive for a truth anything that is directly contrary to our clear and distinct knowledge, v.g. the ideas of one body and one place do so clearly agree, and the mind has so evident a perception of their agreement, that we can never assent to a proposition that affirms the same body to be in two distant places at once. However, it should pretend to the authority of a divine revelation, since the evidence first that we deceive not ourselves in ascribing it to God, secondly that we understand it right, can never be so great as the evidence of our own intuitive knowledge, whereby we discern it impossible for the same body to be in two places at once, and therefore no proposition can be received for divine revelation, or obtain the assent due to all such, if it be contradictory to our clear intuitive knowledge, because this would be to subvert the principles and foundations of all knowledge, evidence, and assent whatsoever, and there would be left no difference between truth and falsehood, no measures of credible and incredible in the world, if doubtful propositions shall take place before self-evident, and what we certainly know give way to what we may possibly be mistaken in. In propositions, therefore, contrary to the clear perception of the agreement or disagreement of any of our ideas, it will be in vain to urge them as matters of faith. They cannot move our assent under that or any other title whatsoever, for faith can never convince us of anything that contradicts our knowledge, because, though faith be founded on the testimony of God, who cannot lie, revealing any proposition to us, yet we cannot have an assurance of the truth of its being a divine revelation greater than our own knowledge, since the whole strength of this certainty depends upon our knowledge that God revealed it, which in this case, where the proposition supposed revealed contradictions our knowledge or reason, will always have this objection hanging to it, which that we cannot tell how to conceive, to come from God, the bountiful author of our being, which if received for true must overturn all the principles and foundations of knowledge he has given us, render all our faculties useless, wholly destroy the most excellent part of his workmanship, our understandings, and put a man in a condition wherein he will have less light, less conduct than the beast that perisheth. For if the mind of man can never have a clearer and perhaps not so clear evidence of anything to be a divine revelation, as it has of the principles of its own reason, it can never have a ground to quit the clear evidence of its reason, to give a place to a proposition whose revelation has not a greater evidence than those principles have. Thus far a man has use of reason and ought to hearken to it, even an immediate and original revelation where it is supposed to be made to himself. But all those who pretend not to immediate revelation, but are required to pay obedience and to receive the truths revealed to others, which by the tradition of writings or word of mouth are conveyed down to them, reason has a great deal more to do, and is that only which can induce us to receive them. For matter of faith being only divine revelation and nothing else, faith, as we use the word called commonly divine faith, has to do with no propositions but those which are supposed to be divinely revealed, so that I do not see how those who make revelation alone the sole object of faith can say that it is a matter of faith and not of reason to believe that such or such a proposition to be found in such or such a book is of divine inspiration, unless it be revealed that that proposition or all in that book was communicated by divine inspiration. Without such a revelation, the believing or not believing that proposition or book to be of divine authority can never be matter of faith, but matter of reason, and such as I must come to an assent to only by the use of my reason, which can never require or enable me to believe that which is contrary to itself, it being impossible for reason ever to procure any assent to that which to itself appears unreasonable. In all things, therefore, where we have clear evidence from our ideas and those principles of knowledge I have above mentioned, reason is the proper judge, and revelation, though it may, in consenting with it, confirm its dictates, yet cannot in such cases invalidate its decrees. Nor can we be obliged, where we have the clear and evident sentence of reason, to quit it for the contrary opinion, under a pretense that it is a matter of faith, which can have no authority against the plain and clear dictates of reason. But thirdly, there being many things wherein we have very imperfect notions, or none at all, and other things of whose past, present, or future existence by the natural use of our faculties we can have no knowledge at all, these, as being beyond the discovery of our natural faculties and above reason, are, when revealed, the proper matter of faith. Thus, that part of the angels rebelled against God and thereby lost their first happy state, and that the dead shall rise and live again, these and the like, being beyond the discovery of reason, are purely matters of faith, with which reason has directly nothing to do. But since God, in giving us the light of reason, has not thereby tied up his own hands from affording us, when he thinks fit, the light of revelation in any of those matters wherein our natural faculties are able to give a probable determination, revelation, where God has been pleased to give it, must carry it against the probable conjectures of reason, because the mind, not being certain of the truth of that it does not evidently know, but only yielding to the probability that appears in it, is bound to give up its assent to such a testimony which, it is satisfied, comes from one who cannot err and will not deceive, but yet it still belongs to reason to judge of the truth of its being a revelation, and of the signification of the words wherein it is delivered. Indeed, if anything shall be thought revelation which is contrary to the plain principles of reason and the evident knowledge the mind has of its own clear and distinct ideas, the reason must be hearkened to, as to a matter within its province, since a man can never have so certain a knowledge that a proposition which contradicts the clear principles and evidence of his own knowledge was divinely revealed, or that he understands the words rightly wherein it is delivered, as he has that the contrary is true, and so is bound to consider and judge of it as a matter of reason, and not swallow it without examination as a matter of faith. First, whatever proposition is revealed to of whose truth or mind by its natural faculties and notions cannot judge, that is purely matter of faith and above reason. Secondly, all propositions whereof the mind, by the use of its natural faculties, can come to determine and judge from naturally acquired ideas, a matter of reason, with this difference still, that in those concerning which it has but an uncertain evidence, and so is persuaded of their truth only upon probable grounds, which still admit a possibility of the contrary, to be true without doing violence to the certain evidence of its own knowledge and overturning the principles of all reason. In such probable propositions, I say, an evident revelation ought to determine our assent even against probability. For where the principles of reason have not evidenced a proposition to be certainly true or false, their clear revelation as another principle of truth and ground of assent may determine, and so it may be matter of faith and be also above reason, because reason, in that particular matter, being able to reach no higher than probability, faith gave the determination where reason came short, and revelation discovered on which side the truth lay. Thus far the dominion of faith reaches, and that without any violence or hindrance to reason, which is not injured or disturbed, but assisted and improved by new discoveries of truth coming from the eternal fountain of all knowledge. Whatever God hath revealed is certainly true, no doubt can be made of it. This is the proper object of faith, but whether it be a divine revelation or no, reason must judge, which can never permit the mind to reject a greater evidence, to embrace what is less evident, nor allow it to entertain probability in opposition to knowledge and certainty. There can be no evidence that any traditional revelation is of divine original in the words we receive it, and in the sense we understand it, so clear and so certain as that of the principles of reason, and therefore nothing that is contrary to and inconsistent with the clear and self-evident dictates of reason has a right to be urged or assented to as a matter of faith, wherein reason hath nothing to do. Whatsoever is divine revelation ought to overrule all our opinions, prejudices, and interest, and hath a right to be received with full assent. Such a submission as this of our reason to faith takes not away the landmarks of knowledge. This shakes not the foundations of reason, but leaves us that use of our faculties for which they were given us. If the provinces of faith and reason are not kept distinct by these boundaries, there will, in matters of religion, be no room for reason at all, and those extravagant opinions and ceremonies that are to be found in the several religions of the world will not deserve to be blamed. For to this crying up of faith in opposition to reason, we may, I think, in good measure ascribe those absurdities that fill almost all the religions which possess and divide mankind. For men, having been principled with an opinion that they must not consult reason in the things of religion, however apparently contradictory to common sense and the very principles of all their knowledge, have let loose their fancies and natural superstition, and have been by them led into so strange opinions and extravagant practices in religion that a considerate man cannot but stand amazed at their follies, and judge them so far from being acceptable to the great and wise God that he cannot avoid thinking them ridiculous and offensive to a sober good man, so that in effect, religion, which should most distinguish us from beasts, and ought most peculiarly to elevate us as rational creatures above brutes, is that wherein men often appear most irrational and more senseless than beasts themselves. Credo quia impossibile est, I believe, because it is impossible, might in a good man pass for a solely of zeal, but would prove a very ill rule for men to choose their opinions or religion by. Chapter 19 of Enthusiasm. He that would seriously set upon the search of truth ought in the first place to prepare his mind with love of it, for he that loves it not will not take much pains to get it, nor be much concerned when he misses it. There is nobody in the commonwealth of learning who does not profess himself a lover of truth. There is not a rational creature that would not take it amiss to be thought otherwise of. And yet for all this one may truly say that there are very few lovers of truth for truth's sake, even amongst those who persuade themselves that they are so. How a man may know whether he be so in earnest is worth inquiry, and I think there is one unerring mark of it, with the not entertaining any proposition with greater assurance than the proofs it is built upon will warrant. Whoever goes beyond this measure of assent, it is plain, receives not the truth in the love of it, loves not truth for truth's sake, but for some other by end, for the evidence that any proposition is true except such as are self-evident, lying only in the proofs a man has of it. Whatsoever degrees of assent he affords it beyond the degrees of that evidence, it is plain that all the surplusage of assurance is owing to some other affection and not to the love of truth, it being as impossible that the love of truth should carry my assent above the evidence there is to me that it is true, as that the love of truth should make me assent to any proposition for the sake of that evidence which it has not, that it is true, which is in effect to love it as a truth because it is possible or probable that it may not be true. In any truth that gets not possession of our minds by the irresistible light of self-evidence or by the force of demonstration, the arguments that gain it assent are the vouchers and gauge of its probability to us, and we can receive it for no other than such as they deliver it to our understandings. Whatsoever credit or authority we give to any proposition more than it receives from the principles and proofs it supports itself upon is owing to our inclinations that way, and is so far a derogation from the love of truth as such, which as it can receive no evidence from our passions or interests, so it should receive no tincture from them. The assuming an authority of dictating to others and a forwardness to prescribe to their opinions is a constant concomitant of this bias and corruption of our judgments, for how almost can it be otherwise but that he should be ready to impose on another's belief who has already imposed on his own? Who can reasonably expect arguments at conviction from him in dealing with others whose understanding is not accustomed to them in his dealing with himself, who does violence to his own faculties, tyrannizes over his own mind, and asserts the prerogative that belongs to truth alone, which is to command assent by only its own authority, i.e. by and in proportion to that evidence which it carries with it. Upon this occasion I shall take the liberty to consider a third ground of assent, which with some men has the same authority and is as confidently relied on as either faith or reason. I mean enthusiasm, which, laying by reason, would set up revelation without it, whereby in effect it takes away both reason and revelation and substitutes in the room of them the ungrounded fancies of a man's own brain, and assumes them for a foundation both of opinion and conduct. Reason is natural revelation, whereby the eternal Father of light and fountain of all knowledge communicates to mankind that portion of truth which he has laid within the reach of their natural faculties. Revelation is natural reason enlarged by a new set of discoveries communicated by God immediately, which reason vouches the truth of by the testimony and proofs it gives that they come from God, so that he that takes away reason to make way for revelation puts out the light of both, and does much what the same as if he would persuade a man to put out his eyes the better to receive the remote light of an invisible star by a telescope. Immediate revelation being a much easier way for men to establish their opinions and regulate their conduct than the tedious and not always successful labor of strict reasoning, it is no wonder that some have been very apt to pretend to revelation and to persuade themselves that they are under the peculiar guidance of heaven in their actions and opinions, especially in those of them which they cannot account for by the ordinary methods of knowledge and principles of reason. Hence we see that in all ages men in whom melancholy has mixed with devotion, or whose conceit of themselves has raised them into an opinion of a greater familiarity with God and a nearer admittance to his favor than is afforded to others, have often flattered themselves with the persuasion of an immediate intercourse with the deity and frequent communications from the divine spirit. God, I own, cannot be denied to be able to enlighten the understanding by a ray darted into the mind immediately from the fountain of light. This they understand he has promised to do, and who then has so good a title to expect it as those who are his peculiar people, chosen by him and depending on him. Their minds being thus prepared, whatever groundless opinion comes to settle itself strongly upon their fancies is an illumination from the Spirit of God, and presently of divine authority, and whatsoever odd action they find in themselves a strong inclination to do, that impulse is concluded to be a call or direction from heaven, and must be obeyed. It is a commission from above, and they cannot err in executing it. This I take to be properly enthusiasm, which, though founded neither on reason nor divine revelation, but rising from the conceits of a warmed or overweening brain, works yet, where it once gets footing, more powerfully on the persuasions and actions of men than either of those two, or both together, men being most forwardly obedient to the impulses they receive from themselves, and the whole man is sure to act more vigorously where the whole man is carried by a natural motion. For strong conceit, like a new principle, carries all easily with it when got above common sense and freed from all restraint of reason and check of reflection. It is heightened into a divine authority in concurrence with our own temper and inclination. Though the odd opinions and extravagant actions enthusiasm has run men into were enough to warn them against this wrong principle, so apt to misguide them both in their belief and conduct. Yet the love of something extraordinary, the ease and glory it is to be inspired and be above the common and natural ways of knowledge, so flatters many men's laziness, ignorance, and vanity, that when once they are got into this way of immediate revelation, of illumination without search, and of certainty without proof and without examination, it is a hard matter to get them out of it. Reason is lost upon them, they are above it, they see the light infused into their understandings and cannot be mistaken. It is clear and visible there, like the light of bright sunshine, shows itself and needs no other proof but its own evidence. They feel the hand of God moving them within, and the impulses of the Spirit, and cannot be mistaken in what they feel. Thus they support themselves, and are sure reasoning hath nothing to do with what they see and feel in themselves. What they have a sensible experience of admits no doubt, needs no probation. Would he not be ridiculous who should require to have it proved to him that the light shines and that he sees it? It is its own proof and can have no other. When the Spirit brings light into our minds, it dispels darkness. We see it as we do that of the sun at noon, and need not the twilight of reason to show it us. This light from heaven is strong, clear, and pure, carries its own demonstration with it, and we may as naturally take a glow-worm to assist us to discover the sun as to examine the celestial ray by our dim candle reason. This is the way of talking of these men. They are sure because they are sure, and their persuasion are right because they are strong in them. For when what they say is stripped off the metaphor of seeing and feeling, this is all it amounts to, and yet these similes so impose on them that they serve them for certainty in themselves and demonstration to others. But to examine a little soberly this internal light and this feeling on which they build so much. These men have, they say, clear light, and they see, they have an awakened sense, and they feel. This cannot, they are sure, be disputed them. For when a man says he sees or feels, nobody can deny him that he does so. But here let me ask, this seeing, is it the perception of the truth of the proposition, or of this, that it is a revelation from God? This feeling, is it a perception of an inclination or fancy to do something, or of the Spirit of God moving that inclination? These are two very different perceptions, and must be carefully distinguished, if we would not impose upon ourselves. I may perceive the truth of a proposition, and yet not perceive that it is an immediate revelation from God. I may perceive the truth of a proposition in Euclid without its being, or my perceiving it to be, a revelation. Nay, I may perceive I came not by this knowledge in a natural way, and so may conclude it revealed without perceiving that it is a revelation of God, because there be spirits which, without being divinely commissioned, may excite those ideas in me, and lay them in such order before my mind that I may perceive their connection, so that the knowledge of any proposition coming into my mind, I know not how, is not a perception that it is from God, much less is a strong persuasion that it is true a perception that it is from God, or so much as true. But however it be called light and seeing, I suppose it is at most but belief and assurance, and the proposition taken for revelation is not such as they know to be true, but take to be true. For where a proposition is known to be true, a revelation is needless, and it is hard to conceive how there can be a revelation to anyone of what he knows already, if therefore it be a proposition which they are persuaded but do not know to be true, whatever they may call it. It is not seeing but believing. For these are two ways whereby truth comes into the mind, wholly distinct, so that one is not the other. What I see, I know to be so by the evidence of the thing itself. What I believe, I take to be so upon the testimony of another. But this testimony I must know to be given, or else what ground have I of believing? I must see that it is God that reveals this to me, or else I see nothing. The question then here is, how do I know that God is the revealer of this to me, that this impression is made upon my mind by His Holy Spirit, and that therefore I ought to obey it? If I know not this, how great soever the assurance is that I am possessed with, it is groundless. Whatever light I pretend to, it is but enthusiasm. For whether the proposition supposed to be revealed be in itself evidently true or visibly probable, or by the natural ways of knowledge uncertain, the proposition that must be well grounded and manifested to be true is this, that God is the revealer of it, and that what I take to be a revelation is certainly put into my mind by Him, and is not an illusion dropped in by some other spirit, or raised by my own fancy. For, if I mistake not, these men receive it for true because they presume God revealed it. Does it not then stand them upon to examine upon what grounds they presume it to be a revelation from God, or else all their confidence is mere presumption, and this light they are so dazzled with is nothing but an ignis fatuus that leads them constantly round in this circle? It is a revelation because they firmly believe it, and they believe it because it is a revelation. In all that is of divine revelation, there is need of no other proof but that it is an inspiration from God, for He can neither deceive nor be deceived. But how shall it be known that any proposition in our minds is a truth infused by God, a truth that is revealed to us by Him, which He declares to us, and therefore we ought to believe? Here it is that enthusiasm fails of the evidence it pretends to. For men thus possessed boast of a light whereby they say they are enlightened and brought into the knowledge of this or that truth. But if they know it to be a truth, they must know it to be so either by its own self-evidence to natural reason, or by the rational proofs that make it out to be so. If they see and know it to be a truth either of these two ways, they in vain suppose it to be a revelation, for they know it to be true the same way that any other man naturally may know that it is so without the help of revelation. For thus all the truths of what kind soever that men uninspired are enlightened with came into their minds and are established there. If they say they know it to be true because it is a revelation from God, the reason is good. But then it will be demanded how they know it to be a revelation from God. If they say by the light it brings with it, which shines bright in their minds, and they cannot resist, I beseech them to consider whether this be any more than what we have taken notice of already, viz., that it is a revelation because they strongly believe it to be true. For all the light they speak of is but a strong, though ungrounded, persuasion of their own minds, that it is a truth. For rational grounds from proofs that it is a truth, they must acknowledge to have none, for then it is not received as a revelation, but upon the ordinary grounds that other truths are received. And if they believe it to be true because it is a revelation, and have no other reason for its being a revelation, but because they are fully persuaded without any other reason that it is true, then they believe it to be a revelation only because they strongly believe it to be a revelation, which is a very unsafe ground to proceed on, either in our tenets or actions. And what readier way can there be to turn ourselves into the most extravagant errors and miscarriages than thus to set up fancy for our supreme and sole guide, and to believe any proposition to be true, any action to be right, only because we believe it to be so? The strength of our persuasions is no evidence at all of their own rectitude. Crooked things may be as stiff and inflexible as straight, and men may be as positive and peremptory in error as in truth. How come else the untractable zealots in different and opposite parties? For if the light which everyone thinks he has in his mind, which in this case is nothing but the strength of his own persuasion, be an evidence that it is from God, contrary opinions have the same title to be inspirations, and God will be not only the father of lights, but of opposite and contradictory lights, leading men contrary ways, and contradictory propositions will be divine truths. If an ungrounded strength of assurance be an evidence that any proposition is a divine revelation, this cannot be otherwise, whilst firmness of persuasion is made the cause of believing, and confidence of being in the right is made an argument of truth. Saint Paul himself believed he did well, and that he had a call to it when he persecuted the Christians whom he confidently thought in the wrong. But yet it was he and not they who were mistaken. Good men are men still liable to mistakes, and are sometimes warmly engaged in errors, which they take for divine truths shining in their minds with the clearest light. Light, true light, in the mind is or can be nothing else but the evidence of the truth of any proposition, and if it be not a self-evident proposition, all the light it has or can have is from the clearness and validity of those proofs upon which it is received. To talk of any other light in the understanding is to put ourselves in the dark, or in the power of the Prince of Darkness, and by our own consent to give ourselves up to delusion, to believe a lie. For if strength of persuasion be the light which must guide us, I ask, how shall anyone distinguish between the delusions of Satan and the inspirations of the Holy Ghost? He can transform himself into an angel of light, and they who are led by this son of the morning are as fully satisfied of the illumination, i.e., are as strongly persuaded that they are enlightened by the Spirit of God as anyone who is so. They acquiesce and rejoice in it, are actuated by it, and nobody can be more sure, nor more in the right, if their own belief may be judged, than they. He, therefore, that will not give himself up to all the extravagances of delusion and error must bring this guide of his light within to the trial. God, when he makes the prophet, does not unmake the man. He leaves all his faculties in the natural state to enable him to judge of his inspiration, whether they be of divine original or no. When he illuminates the mind with supernatural light, he does not extinguish that which is natural. If he would have us assent to the truth of any proposition, he either evidences that truth by the usual methods of natural reason, or else makes it known to be a truth which he would have us assent to by his authority, and convinces us that it is from him by some marks which reason cannot be mistaken in. Reason must be our last judge and guide in everything. I do not mean that we must consult reason and examine whether a proposition revealed from God can be made out by natural principles, and if it cannot, that then we may reject it. But consult it we must, and by it examine whether it be a revelation from God or no. And if reason finds it to be revealed from God, reason then declares for it as much as for any other truth, and makes it one of her dictates. Every conceit that thoroughly warms our fancies must pass for an inspiration, if there be nothing but the strength of our persuasions whereby to judge of our persuasions. If reason must not examine their truth by something extrinsical to their persuasions themselves, inspirations and delusions, truth and falsehood will have the same measure, and will not be possible to be distinguished. If this internal light, or any proposition which under that title we take for inspired, be conformable to the principles of reason, or to the word of God, which is attested revelation, reason warrants it, and we may safely receive it for true, and be guided by it in our belief and actions. If it receive no testimony, no evidence from either of these rules, we cannot take it for a revelation, or so much as for true, till we have some other mark that it is a revelation, besides our believing that it is so. Thus we see the holy men of old, who had revelations from God, had something else besides that internal light of assurance in their own mind to testify to them that it was from God. They were not left to their own persuasions alone, that those persuasions were from God, but had outward signs to convince them of the order of those revelations. And when they were to convince others, they had a power given them to justify the truth of their commission from heaven, and by visible signs to assert the divine authority of a message they were sent with. Moses saw the bush burn without being consumed, and heard a voice out of it. This was something besides finding an impulse upon his mind to go to Pharaoh, that he might bring his brethren out of Egypt, and yet he thought not this enough to authorize him to go with that message, till God, by another miracle of his rod turned into a serpent, had assured him of a power to testify his mission by the same miracle repeated before them, whom he was sent to. Gideon was sent by an angel to deliver Israel from Midianites, and yet he desired a sign to convince him that this commission was from God. These and several the like instances to be found among the prophets of old are enough to show that they thought not an inward seeing or persuasion of their own minds, without any other proof, is sufficient evidence that it was from God, though the Scripture does not everywhere mention their demanding or having such proofs. And what I have said, I am far from denying that God can or doth sometimes enlighten men's minds in the apprehending of certain truths, or excite them to good actions by the immediate influence and assistance of the Holy Spirit, without any extraordinary signs accompanying it. But in such cases too, we have reason and the Scripture, unerring rules to know whether it be from God or no, where the truth embraced is consonant to the revelation in the written word of God, or the action conformable to the dictates of right reason or holy writ, we may be assured that we run no risk in entertaining it as such, because though perhaps it be not an immediate revelation from God, extraordinarily operating in our minds, yet we are sure it is warranted by that revelation which he has given us of truth. But it is not the strength of our private persuasion within ourselves that can warrant it to be a light or motion from heaven. Nothing can do that but the written word of God without us, or that standard of reason which is common to us with all men. Where reason or Scripture is expressed for any opinion or action, we may receive it as of divine authority, but it is not the strength of our own persuasions which can by itself give it that stamp. The bent of our own minds may favour it as much as we please, and may show it to be a fondling of our own, but will by no means prove it to be an offspring of heaven and of divine original. Chapter 20 of Wrong Assent or Error. Knowledge being to be had only of visible and certain truth, error is not a fault of our knowledge, but a mistake of our judgment giving assent to that which is not true. But if assent be grounded on likelihood, if the proper object and motive of our assent by probability, and that probability consists in what is laid down in the foregoing chapters, it will be demanded how men come to give their assents contrary to probability. For there is nothing more common than contrariety of opinions, nothing more obvious than that one man wholly disbelieves what another only doubts of, and a third steadfastly believes and firmly adheres to. The reasons whereof, though they may be very various, yet I suppose may all be reduced to these four: want of proofs, want of ability to use them, want of will to see them, wrong measures of probability. First, by want of proofs, I do not mean only the want of those proofs which are nowhere extant and so are nowhere to be had, but the want even of those proofs which are in being or might be procured. And thus men want proofs who have not the convenience or opportunity to make experiments and observations themselves tending to the proof of any proposition, nor likewise the convenience to inquire into and collect the testimonies of others. And in this state are the greatest part of mankind, who are given up to labor and enslaved to the necessity of their mean condition, whose lives are worn out only in the provisions for living. These men's opportunities of knowledge and inquiry are commonly as narrow as their fortunes, and their understandings are but little instructed, when all their whole time and pains are laid out to still the croaking of their own bellies or the cries of their children. It is not to be expected that a man who drudges on all his life in a laborious trade should be more knowing in the variety of things done in the world than a pack horse who is driven constantly forwards and backwards in a narrow lane and dirty road only to market should be skilled in the geography of the country. Nor is it at all more possible that he who owns leisure, books, and languages, and the opportunity of conversing with a variety of men should be in a condition to collect those testimonies and observations which are in being and are necessary to make out many, nay, most of the propositions that in the societies of men are judged of the greatest moment, or to find out grounds of assurance so great as the belief of the points he would build on them is thought necessary. So that a great part of mankind are, by the natural and unalterable state of things in this world, and the constitution of human affairs, unavoidably given over to invincible ignorance of those proofs on which others build, and which are necessary to establish those opinions. The greatest part of men, having much to do to get the means of living, are not in a condition to look after those of learned and laborious inquiries. What shall we say then? Are the greatest part of mankind, by the necessity of their condition, subjected to unavoidable ignorance in those things which are of greatest importance to them? For of those it is obvious to inquire. Have the bulk of mankind no other guide but accident and blind chance to conduct them to their happiness or misery? Are the current opinions and licensed guides of every country sufficient evidence and security to every man to venture his great concernments on, nigh his everlasting happiness or misery? Or can those be the certain and infallible oracles and standards of truth which teach one thing in Christendom and another in Turkey? Or shall a poor countryman be eternally happy for having the chance to be born in Italy, or a day laborer be unavoidably lost because he had the ill luck to be born in England? How ready some men may be to say some of these things I will not here examine, but this I am sure, that men must allow one or other of these to be true, let them choose which they please, or else grant the God has furnished men with faculties sufficient to direct them in the way they should take, if they will but seriously employ them that way, when their ordinary vocations allow them the leisure. No man is so wholly taken up with the attendance on the means of living as to have no spare time at all to think of his soul and inform himself in matters of religion. Were men as intent upon this as they are on things of lower concernment, there are none so enslaved to the necessities of life who might not find many vacancies that might be husbanded to this advantage of their knowledge. Besides those whose improvements and informations are straitened by the narrowness of their fortunes, there are others whose largeness of fortune would plentifully enough supply books and other requisites for clearing of doubts and discovering of truth, but they are cooped in close by the laws of their countries and the strict guards of those whose interest it is to keep them ignorant, lest knowing more they should believe the less in them. These are as far nigh further from the liberty and opportunities of a fair inquiry than these poor and wretched labourers were before spoke of, and however they may seem high and great, are confined to narrowness of thought and enslaved in that which should be the freest part of man, their understandings. This is generally the case of all those who live in places where care is taken to propagate truth without knowledge, where men are forced at a venture to be of the religion of the country, and must therefore swallow down opinions as silly people do empirics pills, without knowing what they are made of or how they will work, and having nothing to do but believe that they will do the cure. But in this are much more miserable than they, in that they are not at liberty to refuse swallowing what perhaps they had rather let alone, or to choose the physician to whose conduct they would trust themselves. Secondly, those who want skill to use those evidences they have of probabilities, who cannot carry a train of consequences in their heads, nor weigh exactly the preponderancy of contrary proofs and testimonies, making every circumstance its due allowance, may be easily misled to assent to positions that are not probable. There are some men of one, with some but of two syllogisms, and no more, and others that can but advance one step further. These cannot always discern that side on which the strongest proofs lie, cannot constantly follow that which in itself is the more probable opinion. Now that there is such a difference between men in respect of their understandings, I think nobody who has had any conversation with his neighbours will question, though he never was at Westminster Hall or the Exchange on the one hand, nor at almshouses or Bedlam on the other, which great difference in men's intellectuals, whether it rises from any defect in the organs of the body particularly adapted to thinking, or in the dullness or untractableness of those faculties for want of use, or, as some think, in the natural differences of men's souls themselves, or some or all of these together, it matters not here to examine. Only this is evident, that there is a difference of degrees in men's understandings, apprehensions, and reasonings, to so great a latitude that one may, without doing injury to mankind, affirm that there is a greater distance between some men and others in this respect than between some men and some beasts. But how this comes about is a speculation, though of great consequence, yet not necessary to our present purpose. Thirdly, there are another sort of people that want proofs, not because they are out of their reach, but because they will not use them, who, though they have riches and leisure enough, and want neither parts nor other helps, and yet never the better for them, the hot pursuit of pleasure or constant drudgery in business engages some men's thoughts elsewhere. Laziness and occupancy in general, or a particular aversion for books, study, and meditation, keep others from any serious thoughts at all, and some out of fear that an impartial inquiry would not favour those opinions which best suit their prejudices, lives, and designs, content themselves without examination to take upon trust what they find convenient and in fashion. Thus most men, even of those that might do otherwise, pass their lives without an acquaintance with, much less a rational assent to, probabilities they are concerned to know, though they lie so much within their view that to be convinced of them they need but turn their eyes that way. We know some men will not read a letter which is supposed to bring ill news, and many men forbear to cast up their accounts, or so much as think upon their estate, who have reason to fear their affairs are in no very good posture. How men whose plentiful fortunes allow them leisure to improve their understandings can satisfy themselves with a lazy ignorance, I cannot tell, but methinks they have a low opinion of their souls who lay out all their incomes and provisions for the body, and employ none of it to procure the means and helps of knowledge, who take great care to appear always in a neat and splendid outside, and would think themselves miserable in coarse clothes or a patched coat, and yet contentedly suffer their minds to appear abroad in a piebald livery of coarse patches and borrowed shreds, such as it has pleased chance or their country tailor, I mean the common opinion of those they have conversed with, to clothe them in. I will not here mention how unreasonable this is for men that ever think of a future state and their concernment in it, which no rational man can avoid to do sometimes. Nor shall I take notice what a shame and confusion it is to the greatest contemners of knowledge to be found ignorant in things they are concerned to know. But this at least is worth the consideration of those who call themselves gentlemen, that however they may think credit, respect, power, and authority the concomitants of their birth and fortune, yet they will find all these still carried away from them by men of lower condition who surpass them in knowledge. They who are blind will always be led by those that see, or else fall into the ditch, and he is certainly the most subjected, the most enslaved, who is so in his understanding. In the foregoing instances, some of the causes have been shown of wrong assent, and how it comes to pass that probable doctrines are not always received with an assent proportionable to the reasons which are to be had for their probability. But hitherto we have considered only such probabilities whose proofs do exist but do not appear to him who embraces the error. Fourthly, there remains yet the last sort, who even where the real probabilities appear and are plainly laid before them, do not admit of the conviction, nor yield unto manifest reasons, but do either suspend their assent, or give it to the less probable opinion. And to this danger are those exposed who have taken up wrong measures of probability, which are propositions that are not in themselves certain and evident, but doubtful and false, taken up for principles, received hypothesis, predominant passions or inclinations, authority. First, the first and firmest ground of probability is the conformity anything has to our own knowledge, especially that part of our knowledge which we have embraced and continue to look on as principles. These have so great an influence upon our opinions that it is usually by them we judge of truth and measure probability, to that degree that what is inconsistent with our principles is so far from passing for probable with us, that it will not be allowed possible. The reverence born to these principles is so great, and their authority is so paramount to all other, that the testimony not only of other men, but the evidence of our own senses are often rejected. Then, when they offer to vouch anything contrary to these established rules, how much the doctrine of innate principles and that principle are not to be proved or questioned has contributed to this, I will not here examine. This I readily grant, that one truth cannot contradict another, but withal I take leave also to say that every one ought very carefully to beware what he admits for a principle, to examine it strictly and see whether he certainly knows it to be true of itself by its own evidence, or whether he does only with assurance believe it to be so upon the authority of others. For he hath a strong bias put into his understanding, which will unavoidably misguide his assent, who hath imbibed wrong principles and has blindly given himself up to the authority of any opinion in itself not evidently true. There is nothing more ordinary than children's receiving into their minds propositions, especially about matters of religion, from their parents, nurses, or those
about them, which, being insinuated into their unwary as well as unbiased understandings, and fastened by degrees, are at last equally whether true or false, riveted there by long custom and education beyond all possibility of being pulled out again. For men, when they are grown up, reflecting upon their opinions and finding those of this sort to be as ancient in their minds as their very memories, not having observed their early insinuation, nor by what means they got them, they are apt to reverence them as sacred things, and not to suffer them to be profaned, touched, or questioned. They look on them as the Urim and Thummim, set up in their minds immediately by God Himself to be the great and unerring deciders of truth and falsehood, and the judges to which they are to appeal in all manner of controversies.
This opinion of his principles, let them be what they will, being once established in anyone's mind, it is easy to be imagined what reception any proposition shall find, how clearly soever proved, that shall invalidate their authority, or at all thwart these internal oracles, whereas the greatest absurdities and improbabilities, being put agreeable to such principles, go down glibly and are easily digested. The great obstinacy that is to be found in men firmly believing quite contrary opinions, though many times equally absurd in the various religions of mankind, are as evident a proof as they are an unavoidable consequence of this way of reasoning from received traditional principles, so that men will disbelieve their own eyes, renounce the evidence of their senses, and give their own experience the lie, rather than admit of anything disagreeing with these sacred tenets. Take an intelligent Romanist that from the first dawning of any notion in his understanding hath had this principle constantly inculcated, with that he must believe as the Church, i.e. those of his communion, believes, or that the Pope is infallible, and this he never so much as heard questioned, till at 40 or 50 years old he met with one of other principles. How is he prepared easily to swallow, not only against all probability, but even the clear evidence of his senses, the doctrine of transubstantiation? This principle has such an influence on his mind that he will believe that to be flesh which he sees to be bread. And what way will you take to convince a man of any improbable opinion he holds, who, with some philosophers, hath laid down this as a foundation of reasoning, that he must believe his reason for some improperly called arguments drawn from their principles against his senses? Let an enthusiast be principled that he or his teacher is inspired and acted by an immediate communication of the divine Spirit, and you in vain bring the evidence of clear reasons against his doctrine. Whoever, therefore, have imbibed wrong principles are not, in things inconsistent with these principles, to be moved by the most apparent and convincing probabilities, till they are so candid and ingenious to themselves as to be persuaded to examine even those very principles, which many never suffer themselves to do. Secondly, next to these are men whose understandings are cast into a mould and fashioned just to the size of a received hypothesis. The difference between these and the former is that they will admit of a matter of fact and agree with dissenters in that, but differ only in assigning of reasons and explaining the manner of operation. These are not at that open defiance with their senses. With the former, they can endure to hearken to their information a little more patiently, but will by no means admit of their reports in the explanation of things, nor be prevailed on by probabilities which would convince them that things are not brought about just after the same manner that they have decreed within themselves that they are. Would it not be an insufferable thing for a learned professor, and that which his scarlet would blush at, to have his authority of 40 years standing wrought out of hard rock, Greek and Latin, with no small expense of time and candle, and confirmed by general tradition and a reverend beard, in an instant overturned by an upstart novelist. Can anyone expect that he should be made to confess that what he thought his scholars 30 years ago was all error and mistake, and that he sold them hard words and ignorance at a very dear rate? What probabilities, I say, are sufficient to prevail in such a case, and whoever, by the most cogent arguments, will be prevailed with to disrobe himself at once of all his old opinions and pretences to knowledge and learning, which with hard study he hath all this time been labouring for, and turn himself out stark naked, in quest afresh of new notions. All the arguments that can be used will be as little able to prevail as the wind did with the traveller to part with his cloak, which he held only the faster. To this of wrong hypothesis may be reduced the errors that may be occasioned by a true hypothesis or right principles, but not rightly understood. There is nothing more familiar than this, the instances of men contending for different opinions, which they all derive from the infallible truth of the Scripture, are an undeniable proof of it. All that call themselves Christians allow the text that says, metanoite, to carry in it the obligation to a very weighty duty, but yet how very erroneous will one of their practices be who, understanding nothing but the French, take this rule with one translation to be repentis vows, repent, or with the other fightis penitens, do penance. Thirdly, probabilities which cross men's appetites and prevailing passions run the same fate. Let ever so much probability hang on one side of a covetous man's reasoning and money on the other, it is easy to foresee which will outweigh. Earthly minds, like mud walls, resist the strongest batteries, and though perhaps sometimes the force of a clear argument may make some impression, yet they nevertheless stand firm and keep out the enemy truth that would captivate or disturb them. Tell a man passionately in love that he is jilted. Bring a score of witnesses of the falsehood of his mistress. It is 10 to 1, but 3 kind words of hers shall invalidate all their testimonies. Quod volumus facile credimus. What suits our wishes is forwardly believed is, I suppose, what everyone hath more than once experimented, and though men cannot always openly gainsay or resist the force of manifest probabilities that make against them, yet yield they not to the argument, no, but that it is the nature of the understanding constantly to close with the more probable side. But yet a man hath a power to suspend and restrain its inquiries, and not permit a full and satisfactory examination as far as the matter in question is capable and will bear it to be made. Until that be done, there will be always these 2 ways left of evading the most apparent probabilities. First, that the arguments being, as for the most part they are brought in words, there may be a fallacy latent in them, and the consequences being perhaps many in train, there may be some of them incoherent. There be very few discourses so short, clear, and consistent, to which most men may not, with satisfaction enough to themselves, raise this doubt, and from whose conviction they may not, without reproach or disingenuity or unreasonableness, see themselves free with the old reply, non persuadebis etiam si persuaseris. Though I cannot answer, I will not yield. Secondly, manifest probabilities may be evaded, and the assent withheld upon this suggestion that I know not yet all that may he said on the contrary side. And therefore, though I be beaten, it is not necessary I should yield, not knowing what forces there are in reserve behind. This is a refuge against conviction so open and so wide that it is hard to determine when a man is quite out of the verge of it. But yet there is some end of it, And a man having carefully inquired into all the grounds of probability and unlikeliness, done his utmost to inform himself in all particulars fairly, and cast up the sum total on both sides, may in most cases come to acknowledge upon the whole matter on which side the probability rests, wherein some proofs in matter of reason, being suppositions upon universal experience, are so cogent and clear, and some testimonies in matter of fact so universal that he cannot refuse his assent. So that I think we may conclude that in propositions where, though the proofs in view are of most moment, yet there are sufficient grounds to suspect that there is either fallacy in words, or certain proofs as considerable to be produced on the contrary side, their assent, suspense, or dissent are often voluntary actions. But where the proofs are such as make it highly probable, and there is not sufficient ground to suspect that there is either fallacy of words, which sober and serious consideration may discover, no equally valid proofs yet undiscovered, latent on the other side, which alter the nature of the thing, may, in some cases, make plain to a considerate man. There, I think, a man who has weighed them can scarce refuse his assent to the side on which the greater probability appears, whether it be probable that a promiscuous jumble of printing letters should often fall into a method and order which should stamp on paper a coherent discourse, or that a blind fortuitous concourse of atoms, not guided by an understanding agent, should frequently constitute the bodies of any species of animals. In these and the like cases, I think, nobody that considers them can be one jot at a stand which side to take, nor at all waver in his assent. Lastly, when there can be no supposition, the thing in its own nature indifferent, and wholly depending upon the testimony of witnesses, that there is as fair testimony against as for the matter of fact attested, which by inquiry is to be learned, v.g., whether there was 1,700 years ago such a man at Rome as Julius Caesar. In all such cases, I say, I think it is not in a rational man's power to refuse his assent, but that it necessarily follows and closes with such probabilities. In other less clear cases, I think it is in man's power to suspend his assent, and to perhaps content himself with the proofs he has, if they favour the opinion that suits with his inclination or interest, and so stop from further search. But that a man should afford his assent to that side on which the less probability appears to him, seems to me utterly impracticable, and as impossible as it is to believe the same thing probable and improbable at the same time. As knowledge is no more arbitrary than perception, so I think assent is no more in our power than knowledge. When the agreement of any two ideas appears to our minds, whether immediately or by the assistance of reason, I can no more refuse to perceive, no more avoid knowing it, than I can avoid seeing those objects which I turn my eyes to and look on in daylight. And what upon full examination I find the most probable, I cannot deny my assent to. But though we cannot hinder our knowledge where the agreement is once perceived, nor our assent where the probability manifestly appears upon due consideration of all the measures of it, yet we can hinder both knowledge and assent by stopping our inquiry and not employing our faculties in the search of any truth. If it were not so, ignorance, error, or infidelity could not in any case be a fault. Thus in some cases we can prevent or suspend our assent, but can a man versed in modern or ancient history doubt whether there is such a place as Rome, or whether there was such a man as Julius Caesar? Indeed, there are millions of truths that a man is not or may not think himself concerned to know, as whether our King Richard III was crooked or no, or whether Roger Bacon was a mathematician or a magician. In these and such like cases, where the assent one way or other is of no importance, to the interest of anyone, no action, no concernment of his following or depending thereon, there it is not strange that the mind should give itself up to the common opinion, or render itself to the first comer. These and the like opinions are of so little weight and moment that, like motes in the sun, their tendencies are very rarely taken notice of. They are there, as it were, by chance, and the mind lets them float at liberty. But where the mind judges that the proposition has concernment in it, whether assent or not assenting it, thought to draw consequences of moments after it, and good and evil to depend on choosing or refusing the right side, and the mind sets itself seriously to inquire and examine the probability there, I think it is not in our choice to take which side we please, if manifest odds appear on either. The greater probability, I think, in that case will determine the assent, and a man can no more avoid assenting or taking it to be true where he perceives the greater probability than he can avoid knowing it to be true where he perceives the agreement or disagreement of any two ideas. If this be so, the foundation of error will lie in wrong measures of probability, as the foundation of wise in wrong measures of good. Fourthly, the fourth and last wrong measure of probability I shall take notice of, and which keeps in ignorance or error more people than all the other together, is that which I have mentioned in the foregoing chapter. I mean the giving up our assent to the common received opinions, either of our friends or party, neighborhood or country. How many men have no other ground for their tenets than the supposed honesty or learning or number of those of the same profession, as if honest or bookish men could not err, or truth were to be established by the vote of the multitude. Yet this with most men serves the turn. The tenet has had the attestation of reverend antiquity. It comes to me with the passport of former ages, and therefore I am secure in the reception I give it. Other men have been and are of the same opinion, for that as all is said, and therefore it is reasonable for me to embrace it. A man may more justifiably throw up cross and pile for his opinions than take them up by such measures. All men are liable to error, and most men are in many points, by passion or interest, under temptation to it. If we could but see the secret motives that influenced the men of name and learning in the world and the leaders of parties, we should not always find that it was the doctrines they owned and maintained. This at least is certain: there is not an opinion so absurd which a man may not receive upon this ground. There is no error to be named which has not had its professors, and a man shall never want crooked paths to walk in if he thinks that he is in the right way, wherever he has the footsteps of others to follow. But notwithstanding the great noise is made in the world about errors and opinions, I must do mankind that right as to say there are not so many men in errors and wrong opinions as is commonly supposed. Not that I think they embrace the truth, but indeed because concerning those doctrines they keep such a stir about, they have no thought, no opinion at all. For if anyone should a little catechize the greatest part of the partisans of most of the sects in the world, he would not find concerning those matters they are so zealous for that they have any opinions of their own. Much less would he have reason to think that they took them upon the examination of arguments and appearance of probability. They are resolved to stick to a party that education or interest has engaged them in, and there, like the common soldiers of an army, show their courage and warmth as their leaders direct, without ever examining or so much as knowing the cause they contend for. If a man's life shows that he has no serious regard for religion, for what reason should we think that he beats his head about the opinions of his church, and troubles himself to examine the grounds of this or that doctrine? It is enough for him to obey his leaders, to have his hand and his tongue ready for the support of the common cause, and thereby prove himself to those who can give him credit preferment or protection in that society. Thus men become professors of and combatants for those opinions they were never convinced of, no proselytes to. No ever had so much as floating in their heads, and though one cannot say there are fewer improbable or erroneous opinions in the world than there are, yet this is certain, there are fewer that actually assent to them and mistake them for truths than is imagined. Chapter 21 of the Division of the Sciences. All that can fall within the compass of human understanding, being either first the nature of things as they are in themselves, their relations and their manner of operation, or secondly that which man himself ought to do as a rational and voluntary agent for the attainment of any end, especially happiness, or thirdly the ways and means whereby the knowledge of both the one and the other of these is attained and communicated. I think science may be divided properly into these three sorts. First, the knowledge of things as they are in their own proper beings, their constitution, properties and operations, whereby I mean not only matter and body but spirits also, which have their proper natures, constitutions and operations, as well as bodies. This, in a little more enlarged sense of the word, I call physique or natural philosophy. The end of this is bare speculative truth, and whatsoever can afford the mind of man any such falls under this branch, whether it be God himself, angels, spirits, bodies, or any of their affections as number and figure, etc. Secondly, practique, the skill of right applying our own powers and actions for the attainment of things good and useful. The most considerable under this head is ethics, which is the seeking out those rules and measures of human actions which lead to happiness and the means to practice them. The end of this is not bare speculation and the knowledge of truth, but right and the conduct suitable to it. Thirdly, the third branch may be called semiotique, or the doctrine of signs, the most usual whereof being words. It is aptly enough termed also logic, the business whereof is to consider the nature of signs the mind makes use of for the understanding of things or conveying its knowledge to others. For since the things the mind contemplates are none of them besides itself present to the understanding, it is necessary that something else, as a sign or representation of the thing it considers, should be present to it, and these are ideas. And because the scene of ideas that makes one man's thoughts cannot be laid open to the immediate view of another, nor laid up anywhere but in the memory, and no very sure repository. Therefore, to communicate our thoughts to one another as well as record them for our own use, signs of our ideas are also necessary, those which men have found most convenient and therefore generally make use of are articulate sounds. The consideration then of ideas and words as the great instruments of knowledge makes no despicable part of their contemplation who would take a view of human knowledge in the whole extent of it. And perhaps if they were distinctly weighed and duly considered, they would afford us another sort of logic and critique than what we have been hitherto acquainted with. This seems to me the first and most general as well as natural division of the objects of our understanding, for a man can employ his thoughts about nothing but either the contemplation of things themselves for the discovery of truth, or about the things in his own power which are his own actions for the attainment of his own ends, or the signs the mind makes use of both in the one and the other, and the right ordering of them for its clearer information, all which three with things as they are in themselves knowable, actions as they depend on us in order to happiness, and the right use of signs in order to knowledge, being toto, coil or different. They seemed to me to be the three great provinces of the intellectual world, wholly separate and distinct one from another.